as a fan of American Ninja Warrior, I thought we would have the celebrity status here.
My son, of course, is that Ninja Warrior, and I now have a grandson who's in training. He's 2 years old, and he's already learned how to climb out of his crib.
That's good.
So,
you got to start young.
Yeah.
Just to remind everybody, in order for them to be able to hear us, make sure your microphone is on when you need to ask a question or talking. Her presentation will be on the screen as well, but I've also uploaded in your board book, so go ahead and hit refresh so it'll pop up.
Okay, then we will call the meeting of the Virginia Board of Education to order. We have some very distinguished people with us today and looking forward to the presentation. I'd also like to take a minute to introduce the, I guess I can still say new Superintendent of Public Instruction for the Commonwealth of Virginia, Jillian Balow. Welcome. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to say to start out, or we can wait till tomorrow if you'd prefer for the business meeting of the board.
How about if I just say thank you, President Gecker? It's a pleasure to be here, and I'll always take the title of new because in this position I know from a little experience that every day feels like day number one.
There you go. Good to keep it fresh. Okay. Then Dr. Darling Hammond, we're going to turn this over to you for your presentation on the impacts of teacher evaluation and professional development on student outcomes. I think it's a topic the board has been looking at potentially to study in depth, and we look forward to hearing from you. Since you are actually more of a celebrity than your son, Sean, so in our world.
Well, it's great to be here. I share with you the experience of being a state board member. So first, I just want to start with my appreciation for your work and my empathy for what you for what you're working on. I'm here with my colleague, Maria Heiler, who is the director of our DC office and is also a board certified teacher, former teacher educator, and a researcher now on teacher development. And Maria, I don't know if you want to say anything to introduce yourself beyond that.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm here in Maryland, so not so far up the road for us. I hope we'll brace for some bad weather this weekend, I hear.
I'm glad to be on the left coast, as they say, where we don't have that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I actually also have a little video clip. I'm going to hope that works. I'm going to ask you some questions about what you see in the video clip when we get there about teacher effectiveness, and we'll take it from there. So let's see if my technology works properly. And are you seeing my PowerPoint?
No.
Are we good?
No, not yet. Not yet.
Not yet? Okay. Okay. But let me know when we've got it.
Say that all the time, Emily.
Email, I'll go through my door. How are we doing?
I think we've got it now. Thank you. Thanks, Emily.
Terrific.
Yes.
So I'm going to zip through this quickly. You have copies or will have copies, and glad to go back and deep dive into anything that's of interest later. I just want to be sure to give you sort of the panoply and give us a lot of time for conversation. I'm going to draw on two sources. One is a book that I think you might have gotten the first chapter of called Getting Teacher Evaluation Right. And the other is a book that was a study of high quality teacher development systems in countries around the world called Empowered Educators. We looked at 5 nations, including Singapore, Finland, Australia, Canada, and Shanghai, China. So I draw on both those. The teacher evaluation question is a challenging one that I know that folks have been dealing with for quite some time. There are lots of reasons for this. Historically, we've had a lack of coherent and meaningful standards. Time is an issue. Expertise is an issue. linking it to professional development. Sometimes the processes are unwieldy for making decisions. And then there are challenges in figuring out how to attend to student learning. The recent history of teacher evaluation, Virginia has been a part of, as have all states. Before 2002, there was, generally speaking, little state role, and systems were often quite weak. Across the country, there was the federal race to the top and the waivers that incentivized states to introduce teacher evaluation, including student test results, that occurred after 2008. There has been a lot of research showing unstable results of test-based value-added measures for many teachers, and I see that you are ensuring that this contribution is a modest one to your overall system now. The federal guidance was set aside when ESSA was authorized, and so many states are now currently defining their teacher evaluation system. Hopefully that refinement will make systems better, but evaluation could even make matters worse. So, just to frame the problems that can be out there, sometimes evaluation just becomes a set of procedures, and the procedures can feel like a lot of hoops for people to jump through, to get through, and to get the form signed, rather than focusing on competence and effectiveness. So I'm really going to focus us, as you asked me to, on what really supports teacher effectiveness in terms of their influence on student learning. It can be challenging if we get complicated systems that put all the weight on school principals or very busy people. If we design systems that can't be implemented, if we create systems that focus on ranking individual teachers against each other, rather than improving the collective quality of teaching. And I want to pause there just to note that there's been a lot of research in recent years about how collective efficacy is a huge driver of student achievement. This is the way in which teachers in a school, as a group, come to share practices and develop ways of working that are effective, and that they share those so the kids are getting a coherent experience, and teachers are continually collaborating to improve. So individual teacher evaluation can either work with that or can work against it, and that's an important criteria. So I want to start with the end in mind. How do we help teachers become effective? And evaluation is only one piece of how we help teachers become effective, but it should fit in with the other pieces. I'm going to show you a teacher. She's a national board certified teacher in Detroit, Michigan, science teacher, just a few minutes of her classroom. And I want you to be thinking about what you see. She does get extremely powerful outcomes with her students. What do you see that may contribute to those outcomes? What are some of the elements of effectiveness? And I'm going to come back and ask you about that in a minute.
We're scientists ourselves, right? We want to find out if it's true that the cellular membrane is permeable. It means it lets things in and out, right? So we're going to use an egg, okay, everyone? We're going to use an egg. You see in the classroom when I asked the students, how would you get the membrane initially? That a lot of them thought, I'll boil the egg. Because they took their past experiences, they boil the egg, they peel it off, the membrane's right there. But I had to get them to understand that this is a living cell, and the living cell has cytoplasm. It has cytoplasm that surrounds the nucleus, so you can't do that, so what are you going to do? And you start peeling off. And then you ain't never bought no egg, yeah. Like hardwood, and that's a lot of cytoplasm. And it's more I had the students decide how to dissolve it. And then that made them interested. If I would have just said, okay, today you are going to dissolve the membrane of an egg in vinegar, they would have said, okay. I would ask them 2 days later, what did you dissolve? What acid did you use? They would say, I don't know, whatever you told us to. But see, now if I ask them to say vinegar, and I'm saying, no, pH low enough to dissolve the membrane, to dissolve the eggshell without affecting the membrane. That's how I did that. A couple of the groups broke their egg accidentally, and they thought, oh, the experiment is now a disaster. But that's, I wanted them to science, that there's limitations in life. The scientific word is a limitation. What's the problem? What is this? You're a scientist. Limitation. Why is it a limitation?
Membrane dissolved.
Were you, okay, exactly, what is this?
The membrane.
All right, let's look at it.
Yeah.
All right, can you describe the membrane?
It's rubbery, like almost.
Absolutely. So if it's rubbery, does it have pores in it? But we can't see them. How can you prove there are pores in it?
Microscope.
But without a microscope, how could you prove in your scientific investigation that
the vinegar got in.
the opportunity for them to see the consistency of the membrane and to see they can't see the pores. They cannot see the pores, but they're microscopic. Well, they read that. Learned that in some past experience that we've done because I didn't lecture to that. So that was a learning experience for them. What happened?
It rose.
It's way more. Yeah. There you go. It's
Like a balloon.
You got it. Hey, look, they have to feel secure in making a mistake and not thinking will be ridiculed by me or the other students in the classroom, and they have to be able to answer. I don't know everything, and the kids can ask something, and if I don't know it and I tell them I'm going to look it up, they feel more secure with me asking them questions and them not knowing the answer. But the best thing to do is to go around and catch it. Catch them while they're doing it, get them to think about it.
For a minute. And I'm going to ask you, what did you see that were elements of what makes her an effective teacher in that video? And I'm going to ask someone there at the table, the chair, to call on folks because I can't see you well enough to do that.
I'm happy to call on people. Thanks. Mr. Swan.
I'll go. I saw relationships. I saw the teacher as the facilitator. She did less talking and allowed the students to talk more. I saw the Virginia 5 C's, which was collaboration, creative thinking, communication, the citizenship with the respect for each other as the peers, and the critical thinking when the teacher came around as the facilitator asking those questions. I like when the teacher said how she allowed the students to be secure in making mistakes. Because a lot of students do not like to participate in learning. And when they see that the teacher doesn't know everything, it makes them more comfortable. And she kind of alluded to that as well. And so those are the things that I saw that made her an effective teacher.
Great. Others?
Any sitting superintendents want to answer?
Well, I was just, I
Dr.
mean,
Mann.
after that, I mean, drop the mic. That was a drop the mic moment, Mr. Swan. But I guess I would add, she seemed to also be aware of the experiences the children were bringing or maybe familiar to them as a part of really making the learning active. And I thought that was notable.
Dr. Robertson?
I saw proximity, how she positioned herself in the classroom effectively. I saw her creating an anticipatory set for what the lesson should entail. Saw her monitoring the work of the individual groups, and I saw her recognizing success when it occurred.
Anybody else? Ms. Holton?
I saw her willing to accept a level of controlled chaos. It was controlled, but there was chaos, and she was willing to let that go on. And the cacophony of conversation and learning didn't upset her. It was part of the plan.
And Superintendent Belo?
Thank you. I've never used this term before, but there was evidence-based confidence building. She didn't just say, good job. She said, you did this because you knew this, or you knew this, therefore you were able to do this. And she really built the confidence of the students in an individual evidence-based way.
Yeah, I think you have exhausted us now, Doctor.
Okay. That was really good. And, just one or two other things that were kind of embedded in what you said, but just to draw them out. She asked those questions that scaffolded them towards an understanding. So she was really able to enable them through her very skillful questioning. She also was doing an identity treatment for them. Did you notice how many times she said, you're scientists? And she was, they were taking on the identity of being scientists. You're scientists in your scientific investigation. How could you do that? And so that was also sort of an affirming a piece of their academic identity. So all those things. So when you look at your teacher evaluation system, you want to think about to what extent the 5 C's that you mentioned, the other elements that you mentioned, which were right on the money, are represented in the teacher evaluation instrument, in the standards that you currently have. How are those reflected, and where might there need to be, or where might it be useful to have, if not additions to the standards, some additions to the indicators for the standards that reflect this kind of thing, and thinking about what do effective teachers do, what does it look like? So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint now. You guys are excellent analysts of teaching, and talk about how we get that into the system. I'm going to ask if maybe you could mute your microphones, because I'm getting a lot of feedback and I'm not sure exactly where it's coming from, but when I stop, we can turn them back on again. So we'll share this again, and I will get past the place where we were. Oh, I'm inadvertently adding slides. Didn't want to do that. Here we go. So as you saw, the effective teachers, this is from the research now. They engage students in that active learning that builds on what they know. You could see that she was thinking about what they knew before. You identified that very purposeful task. It was very well planned, and that controlled chaos happened because of the good planning that had happened. A variety of teaching strategies, assessing student learning was going on throughout the whole time. They create effective scaffolds and supports. She was teaching a lot of academic vocabulary and academic language too. I actually learned from watching this about cytosol and other things that I had forgotten about from whatever grade it was that I might have had that in science class. Clear standards, a lot of feedback. What you will also see in classes is opportunities for revising work. Critically important for getting optimal achievement is giving students opportunity to get feedback and then redo or revise, because that's how we get to proficiency in any field, whether it's, Ninja Warrior, or whether it's, music, art, or academics. And then a collaborative classroom, and all the students belong, they feel affirmed in their learning. You could see that happening. So those are things that are coming out in the research. It's very important. And again, that you might want to look for in your standards and indicators. We also know that learning is enhanced by formative assessments and well-scaffolded instruction that builds on prior knowledge, cultural practices, and experiences. The right amount of challenge, that you're creating a task that's in the zone or at the edge of the zone of proximal development, just the right amount of challenge with the right amount of support on challenging tasks is what moves kids forward. So task construction is important. Inquiry, explicit instruction, connected. It's not one, it's not the other, it's a combination of both. Reducing stereotype threats. Stereotype threat is what students in minoritized groups that may be stigmatized in society bring with them as an anxiety into the classroom. Will I be viewed as competent? Will I be accepted? Will I belong? That can be a function of race or ethnicity. It can be immigration status, language background. It can be sexual orientation. It can be gender. It can be disability status. And so you reduce stereotype threat by affirming students, showing that you can see them and their capacity, and then of course teaching to that capacity, and then supporting that growth mindset, which turns out to be a huge engine for learning. What this means for educator development, both pre-service and in-service, and the way it gets connected to an evaluation system, is that it should emphasize both learner pedagogy, that is knowing about your learners and how they learn, and content pedagogy, knowing about your subject and how to teach it well. And in an evaluation system, capturing both learner pedagogy and content pedagogy is a sort of an art form, and I'll talk more about both the ways we do that, the ways we develop it. Maria will talk more about that in a little bit, and also how you can structure the system to access knowledge from evaluators. So that includes kind of knowing how kids develop and learn, The practices that support integrated social, emotional, and cognitive development, we know now from neuroscience and all of the other learning and development that social and emotional and cognitive development go together. One is not a distraction from the other. If we feel positively about an environment, if we're socially adept, if we're cued into others, we can collaborate effectively, we can learn more effectively. If we're anxious, if we're traumatized, if we feel unwelcome, if we're worried about what's going to happen to us, it actually puts a great deal of filter between the content and the brain and makes it much more difficult to learn. Knowledge of how to recognize and address trauma and stereotypes throughout, as I've said, engage in restorative practices that bind kids more fully to the community and enable them to be able to sort of be who they are and say what they need to say in the right setting. Cultural knowledge and competence, wide repertoire of skills and resources for scaffolding, including universal design for learning, which is becoming more and more important in multi-tiered systems of support and typically is not in many evaluation systems, and the development of those practices for deeper learning that you mentioned earlier. So investments in teachers' knowledge matter a lot. I'll just sort of stipulate to that. There's been large-scale research in multiple states that have found that student learning gains are related to having a strong academic background, quality preparation prior to entry, including a comprehensive preparation that includes thoughtful clinical experiences, and knowledge of learning development, teaching methods, curriculum, certification in the field, experience, and the skills measured by National Board Certification. In North Carolina, they found that in combination, these skills predicted more of the difference in student learning gains than race and parent education combined. That's a huge thing to consider. And so our policies should strengthen those features and also equalize their availability across different classrooms, schools, and communities. To get to teacher effectiveness, we need a coherent system in what we do in recruitment and preparation and induction and mentoring and ongoing professional learning and evaluation and curriculum all go together. And that's what we see in the highest performing systems around the world. In those systems in high achieving nations, you see strong universal free preparation with extensive training in model schools, typically in master's degree programs now, in places like Singapore and Finland and Australia and Canada. Quality mentoring for every beginner, competitive and equitable salaries. Obviously, that's important for retention. In most of these countries, they have at least 15 hours a week for collaborative planning and learning. In the United States, that we typically have only about 8 hours a week for any kind of planning, and it's usually individual. And there's about an additional 8 hour a week gap between us and the average internationally. They have sustained and practice-based collegial learning opportunities and teaching careers and actually career ladders that help people become mentor teachers, senior teachers, master teachers in every school, available then to mentor the next generation of teachers and share their expertise. There's a lot of networking for sharing practices across schools and proactive recruitment and development of leaders. And I'll just note that states like Connecticut, Illinois, and North Carolina all have very important elements of what they do with teacher evaluation that has to do with principal development, principal recruitment, training, principal evaluation, which rests on, in part, on how well principals can do the things that teachers need to become effective. So those should be maybe thought about together, and you may want to be thinking about your principal evaluation systems and principal development systems as you're thinking about the teacher evaluation. The other point I want to make is that while we think about teachers as being very important to student learning, and they are, teaching effectiveness goes beyond individual teacher variables. So the economists who've estimated what proportion of student achievement can be attributed to individual teachers is only about 7 to 10%. The other things that matter include the effectiveness of peers. Teams of teachers collaborating and planning curriculum together are more effective and drive greater effectiveness in a school than individual teachers working alone. student availability for learning, you know, their attendance, health, home context, all the things that might require other student supports, particularly as we see growing poverty, homelessness, as we see the effects of the pandemic. So those integrated supports actually boost student achievement in schools because teachers then have that to rely on for their students as well as their own efforts. And then, of course, resources for learning matter, curriculum, class size, specialist supports, and so on. So we can't put it all on the individual teacher, but we can create an environment in which individual teachers can be more effective in a collaborative workplace, working with a team, having high quality curriculum materials. By the way, teachers are more effective if they loop with their same students over more than 1 year, and they're more effective if they teach the same course in secondary school for more than 1 year. That is, when teachers are asked to jump around from grade to grade or course to course, it reduces their effectiveness. And all of these elements depend on school leaders. So one of the things that we need to do to improve teacher effectiveness is to focus on principal effectiveness. And so principal training and evaluation should support teacher evaluation and development, which includes well-informed instructional leadership, support for professional learning and collaboration, thoughtful development of the organization, skillful management of improvement, as well as knowledgeable analysis of teaching and productive feedback to teachers. There was one study of principal development that we just reviewed in a literature review in which the principals who knew how to look at teaching, understand what they saw, give useful feedback to teachers, drove greater effectiveness in their schools. And the principals who were giving more feedback to teachers because they had an evaluation expectation, but didn't know how to do it well, actually produced a negative effect. So a lot of times we think about, well, let's train the principals to use the teacher evaluation tool. But there's a lot more that needs to be done in training principals for the work they do in the school, as well as to evaluate teachers, and that ought to be reflected in their on-ramp into the profession and their training for their own evaluation. So how can teacher evaluation help support effectiveness directly? One thing is to use professional standards coherently. There are a set of standards. A lot of these came from the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards back in the 1990s, and then those got translated into licensure standards. Virginia is also, by the way, a member of a teacher licensure collaborative that LPI is supporting for multiple states that are looking at how to bring their licensure standards up into the sort of 21st century science of learning and development. And many of the features that you all noticed in that video are the subject of that work. But your standards for evaluation ought to track to your standards for preparation and accreditation of teacher and principal preparation programs, licensure and certification assessments, professional practice and evaluation, and mentoring and professional development. Ideally, that is all glued together so that teachers and principals are getting a set of common measures. Your current evaluation standards are comprehensive in many ways and have just added culturally responsive teaching and equitable practices, which is responsive to the emerging knowledge base. But they are not yet glued to all of those other things. For example, there are new things that have come about since the evaluation system was designed, including the profile of a Virginia educator, which is very thoughtful, and it really looks like it builds on a lot of the research. It is not glued to the teacher evaluation standards yet, and perhaps not also to the licensure and other standards that I talked about. So that's a thing to consider, is how to make it coherent. The teaching career can also be made more coherent by thinking about tiers of licensure and evaluation and assessment. In New Mexico, they have evaluation in a 3-tiered system, which includes the beginning teacher licensure assessments around the standards that then are reevaluated in the professional license assessment and in ongoing teacher evaluation, and then may lead to more advanced and accomplished assessment and roles through national board certification. Another thing to think about is how to integrate the sources of evidence with each other. Many evaluation systems, and I think this is true of Virginia's, have different pieces and they're tallied up and then averaged together with some kind of weighting system. But it is important, if we want to help teachers improve, that part of the process actually look at the standards-based measures of practice, which you have in the system, along with the evidence of collegial contributions, measures of student learning and growth, linked by teachers' goals for how they want to develop and considered in their context, so that teachers and principals are able to make sense of how these things come together into a teacher's practice. I will note that there's very little emphasis in the current Virginia system on evidence of collegial contributions. There is a place where there's a bullet for that, but I'm going to talk about other ways that emphasizing and supporting collegiality and collaboration could be thought about, because it is such a driver for greater effectiveness. Obviously, you're also using multiple measures to reflect practice, including the standards-based observations and curriculum plans and evidence of practice that support certain student learning and feedback surveys, et cetera. So you've got a variety of those. Thinking about whether they are tapping what you want is part of the process as well. And then using multiple measures to assess student learning. In the current system in Virginia, there are a number of test data elements, including division level data on diagnostics like MAP and so on, and other indicators that are academic assessments. There are systems that as well use classroom assessments, pre and post unit tests, essays, research projects, et cetera, as part of that basket of evidence that may use things like, if you're an AP teacher, may use the AP test scores. If you're an international baccalaureate teacher, they may use the international baccalaureate scores. If you're an elementary teacher, you might use the developmental reading assessment, which allows you to see student gains over time or accomplishment of learner goals. So it struck me that that's a place to think about how to reflect best what that teacher is responsible for in ways that will allow them to demonstrate what they're focusing on in student learning and what their outcomes are. There are many systems that are goal-setting systems where teachers each year set particular goals for themselves and then set particular measures that they'd like to evaluate themselves on. So, for example, I want to improve my teaching of quadratic equations, and I'm going to decide on having a pre-assessment of that unit and a post-assessment, and I'm going to do these things to improve my knowledge and skill for that, and then evaluate them in that way. So adding that opportunity for teachers to map that to their particular curriculum, to what they themselves are trying to accomplish, could be very helpful. And then I mentioned the collaboration piece. Collaboration is related to teachers' sense of efficacy, whether they use more sophisticated practices, their effectiveness. It is a predictor of student achievement gains. And it can be enhanced by teacher evaluation practices. In some countries, like the ones that I talked about earlier, collaboration is a major criterion for evaluation. It's not a single bullet under professionalism. It is an element of it in and of itself. And it is something, therefore, that teachers are striving to. Of course, the school has to structure means for that collaboration as well. It can be a process in an evaluation system by which teachers set goals and plan strategies and assess their progress together. In the book I mentioned, Getting Teacher Evaluation Right, you'll see some examples of states that have, and districts that have processes by which collaborative processes by which teachers do their evaluation goal setting and decide on what their measures of student learning will be, and help each other think about ways to improve practice and assess their progress together. There are some places too where teachers can, in the years where they are, the requirement is that every third year you have a formal individual evaluation. There are some places, including Santa Clara school district right up the street from where I live, where teachers can do their evaluation as a team and set goals together. I saw one example where a couple of teachers decided they wanted to improve writing in the content areas. They set some goals, they decided on some professional development, they worked with each other to do some new practices. They saw huge effects of those. They talked to their department about it. The whole department started to do it pretty soon. The whole school had a new writing program, which came from a teacher evaluation starting place, but grew into an effectiveness strategy that went beyond those couple of teachers. Teachers can give each other feedback around their goals, and in some schools you have reciprocal observations where teachers are trained to give each other feedback, and teachers can ask for their partner to look at certain things that they're doing in the classroom and give feedback. And so the other thing is that student learning evidence can be used to promote that collaboration by analyzing the work that students do in teams, by setting school-wide subject level, grade level, team-based goals. You can see how educators can factor in a focus on student learning in a collaborative way that also informs the teacher evaluation process. I would just note that the U.S. Has less collaboration time for teachers than almost any other country. We have more hours spent on teaching each week and year in the United States than any other country that participates in OECD studies in the world. And we're at the very bottom in terms of collaborative planning and time. And that will take some redesign. There's about an 8-hour differential in access to time for American teachers versus the international average. There are ways to do that redesign. Some schools have done it. It is something that is important as an adjunct to evaluation. Because if we're evaluating people on things that they don't have the opportunity to learn to do, where evaluation is a set of hoops, but it's not actually a lever for effectiveness. Obviously, we also want to develop effective processes. I mentioned the training of principals for teacher evaluation and support, but we can also include principals' ability to do that in their own evaluations. We can also use expert teachers to support beginning teachers and coaching peers in need. I don't know if in Virginia there are peer assistance and review systems, but what they do in the places where they are operating is they help the principal by identifying a set of mentor teachers. And as part of the evaluation process, there's usually a committee. It's usually members of the Teachers Association as well as the administration that oversees the peer assistance and review process. Every beginning teacher gets a mentor in their content area or grade level. And that mentor is actually by contract able to input into the evaluation process for the beginning teacher and give them more help than a principal can often find time to give. And then if there are teachers who are in need, who are struggling, they can be opted into the intervention part of the process by themselves, recommended in by peers, or recommended in by the principal. And once they're in that support system part of the process, they get a mentor also who meets with them every week and then contributes to a record of what the improvement has been that can be used in tenure and continuation cases. And it ends up eliminating litigation. It provides the due process and it structures the collegial work that teachers do and that they get help to do. It helps the principal have an extra set of eyes and ears and arms and legs for the really intensive work that some teachers need. The other thing that an effective process can do is structure collegial work around goals for teachers in the off years. That could be a time when teachers are working with each other around their goal setting and process, and the principal does not have to be involved unless they are in a category of teachers that needs additional support, help, and evaluation. Right now, Virginia school leaders in most districts seem to carry the whole load. They are the sole evaluators, and that kind of varies based on school division what kind of training is going on for them, and they don't have necessarily access to senior accomplished teachers to support some of that. The current system, I'm told, is more summative than formative as it's implemented. It does not yet have a clear system of support for novices. There's a broad variation in the quality of feedback from observations, a little connection between evaluation and professional development. And I'm going to jump ahead for 1 second here to a slide I was leaving for the end. There's a new report that you may have seen that just came out on Virginia teacher licensure policy from Virginia Commonwealth University, but they do mention in their review of the teacher evaluation system and the extent to which it supports teacher diversity, that there are some concerns about potential bias in teacher evaluations and supervision requirements, and a desire for more clarity, more clear indicators to address that, more training, and then a more comprehensive beginning teacher induction model, as well as support for national board certified teachers. So I'm going to pass the ball to Maria, who's going to talk a little bit about how do you connect evaluation to high quality professional learning. Obviously, one way that can be done is through the goal setting process that I described earlier, that teachers could engage in to identify what kind of professional learning they're going to use to achieve their goals. Can also happen as a result of evaluation. So Maria, I'm going to pass the ball to you.
Thank you, Linda. And so, can you all, oh,
are you seeing the right slides for me?
not yet, it went back. So just if you click on,
There we go.
there you go, yes. So if we're thinking about the desire to connect evaluation to high quality professional learning, we can do that through goal setting and purposeful learning. And so what that looks like is a focus on specific curriculum content. When you're thinking about what an English teacher needs, it's different than what a elementary literacy expert might need as well. It needs to be organized around real problems of practice that teachers are facing in the classroom, dilemmas with students, the work they're doing with their children and students, and the types of learning opportunities they're building and they're collaborating with their peers with. It needs to be linked to analysis of teaching and student learning, intensive, sustained, and continuous over time. So not just popping in every now and then to look at a teacher, but really over time. It needs to be supported by coaching, modeling, observation, and feedback, an iterative process, connected to teachers' collaborative work with professional learning communities, and integrated into school and classroom planning around curriculum instruction and assessment. And as you can see, these are linked back to everything that Linda was talking about around effective teachers and environments around effective teaching and learning. So traditionally, when we think about professional development, it's been lecture-based and what we might call sit and get or drive-by learning. And it offers the same content and strategies to all teachers, regardless of their skills and experiences, and has largely been divorced from teachers' day-to-day practices in their classrooms. We're excited that rigorous research indicates that professional development programs with an impact on student learning follow a different model defined by 7 core elements. And we did a study that identified these 7 elements. I'll just take a second to go through them. A focus on content, so the actual content that teachers teach in their classrooms, and I'll speak to this a little bit in a moment. And active learning, so professional development that offers teachers a chance to meaningfully engage with new concepts and teaching strategies by actually doing them. And if we think about what students need to learn and thrive, teachers need the same types of activities and learning opportunities that students need. A lecture is not going to give you the same benefit as sitting and actually doing a science lab that they're going to then take into their classroom and use with their students. Collaboration, this can look like one-on-one coaching, small groups, professional learning communities, and it can be, as we now know more directly, it can be either in-person or virtual using technology. This is often occurring in job-embedded contexts when teachers can plan together, offer each other feedback, and problem solve about their specific students. Models and modeling. It's important to provide teachers with models of effective teaching. So there's a clear vision of what best practice looks like. This could be curricular resources like lesson and unit plans, student work or teaching courses, and it can be observations of peers or master teachers. Coaching, we know that effective coaching is necessary for professional development because it tailors specific advice and counsel to the needs of individual teachers rather than giving a one-size-fits-all experience. And then, of course, feedback and reflection is necessary to give teachers the opportunity of powerful learning moments, regardless of the format. So it could be teachers offering that feedback and reflection together or individually, and it helps the teacher move towards an expert vision of expert vision of practice. And then finally, effective professional development requires a sustained amount of time. And you can go ahead to the next slide, Linda. Because one study in 2007 was a review of an experimental study, found that student achievement increased by 21 percentile points among programs offer extended PD, which is 49 hours on average over 6 to 12 months. And so it's important to see that the 49 hours were over 6 to 12 months. So it really needs to increase student achievement, a sustained duration of a significant amount of time. These one-off workshops just don't work for high quality professional learning. And then when we think about what increases effectiveness and what that professional development looks like in practice, we think about learning opportunities focused on practice like national board certification, where individuals are going through the process, or there's actually cohorts school-wide that improve the practice and the culture of the whole school. And there are 25 national board certification actual levels and certificates by subject matter. So it's very specific to grade level and also content level. Also, teachers need access to mentoring and coaching from accomplished teachers, as was mentioned before, as an element of effective PD. Effective time with teams and the opportunity to work collaboratively. And we know that is a challenge, as Linda just showed the research on how little time is built into the actual school day for teachers to work together. And that's important for the increasing effectiveness. And then we also need to think about focused opportunities to enhance expertise through content networks and collegial professional development, such as the National Writing Project, content networks such as the National Council for Teachers of Mathematics, or the National Councils of Teachers of English. A focus on developing content knowledge is really important, and some strategies to do that include what I just mentioned, content and level specific mentoring. So an elementary teacher matched with an elementary coach, a physics teacher matched with a physics coach, because we know the knowledge and skills for each of those are different. And so we want to make sure that the mentoring is specific to both the content and the level. Participation in curriculum planning with role-like teachers. So this could be grade specific, or it could be all the English teachers, 9th through 12th, coming together to talk about curriculum across the spectrum, but really the opportunity to support one another in their planning and to help develop the skills across small cohorts of content-specific teachers. Again, the content-specific teaching networks that I just mentioned, National Board Certification is an excellent way. Having gone through it myself, it's not just an assessment, it actually is a learning opportunity, and Many districts have cohorts of teachers that go through the process together that helps to talk about your work and think about your work, and then develop your practice into accomplished teaching. And then the Instructional Leadership Court is an example in California. The ILC was formed to support implementation of new standards. Board certified teachers, as well as other accomplished teachers and leaders, formed teams that learned together. It was a trainer of trainers model. So these folks came together and they learned about the new standards and ways to implement them. And they went back to their districts to support the shifts in pedagogy, and were there over time to continue to support teachers as they learned the new standards and learned how to implement them into their daily practice. Not only is it important to develop content pedagogy, but also learner pedagogy. So teachers need to know and understand how students learn. And some ways that that can happen is through national board certification. Each certification has up to 16 standards. At least 1 to 3 of them focus on learning. So that's an excellent way to understand learners and learning. Authentic assessments of learning, such as project-based learning or formative assessment, where teachers can understand how individual and groups of students learn and then use that learning to modify their teaching. The use of tools for two-way pedagogy, such as classroom meetings, one-on-one, conferencing, journaling, exit tickets, surveys to help understand where misconceptions are, where there might need some modification of instruction. Team discussion of students to share needs and strategies. Again, that collaboration time is so important to teaching and learning in the classroom. And it's not just the classroom learning, but teachers need to know and understand students' lives and the learning and the critical thinking that happens in their daily lives. So guided community walkthroughs, home visits, parent-family conferences with protocols for partnering can be some ways of developing that learner pedagogy. And then there's also explicit pedagogical study in professional learning, such as Zaretta Hammond outlines in her Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, where she shares how to understand and connect cultural knowledge and understanding to learning in the classroom. I'm going to go ahead and pass that back to you, Linda, so you can summarize what was just said, and we can take some questions.
Yeah, and those things that Maria just mentioned can be the things that would be suggested to a teacher who's trying to improve in an area as opportunities for professional learning. So you notice that some of them are explicit professional development, and some are activities and processes that are part of what one might do in a school that could be part of a goal setting process, part of a commitment to develop skills, or as part of a quote unquote prescription from the evaluator saying, one of the things we'd like you to do is to engage in X, Y, or Z. Just to close, if we really care about effectiveness rather than just getting through the procedures, we need to be thinking then about preparation and mentoring. That could be actually enhanced for beginners in the teacher evaluation system, the teaching conditions, the collegial learning opportunities, and then the systems that are coherent in their standards, linked to the professional development and coaching. Rigorous at tenure and other key junctures like the peer assistance and review processes. It allows a real dive before you give tenure with serious evaluation from more than one evaluator, and it allows a dive at a point where a teacher may be struggling for that attention, or in a tiered system at key junctures, and then finally designed to provide that assistance and due process and timely decisions, as well as having well thought through forms. So with that, I'm going to stop and we can talk about whatever's on your mind.
Okay, well, thank you very much to both of you for the incredibly informative presentation. I'm sure members of the board have got some questions, and I know I do, but we'll start again with Mr. Swan.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was very informative. I am a current classroom instructional coach, and as a teacher, I saw that you constantly use the national board certification. How do you encourage teachers to pursue national board certification? especially if they have struggled to become a certified teacher in the very beginning, such as having to take the praxis, in my instance, 3 times, in the instance of some of my colleagues, 15 times, as well as taking the school leadership exam, the lack of money to do all of those things. How would you encourage those teachers who are totally discouraged with getting any more certification due to the fact of struggling to be certified initially?
Yeah. One of the things I'm just going to give you my both research-based and personal view on that. I think we should be moving away from sit-down tests that are only marginally related to the ability to teach to performance assessments. So in California in 1998, the legislature required us to use for licensure a teacher performance assessment. A set of universities created one called the Performance Assessment for California Teachers. It's a portfolio that was modeled after the National Board portfolio, in which teachers have to, plan a unit of instruction a short unit of instruction that is mapped to the state standards in their content area. It is content-based, so it's a different instrument for each content area. Teach that, be videotaped teaching it, collect evidence of student learning, evaluate that evidence and say what they would do next to promote more student learning. It's very transformative for teacher education because all of a sudden teacher education had to pay attention to the ability to pull all the skills together and be coherent and help people learn how to assess. We, of course, had elements in there that also were around meeting the needs of particular kinds of students with disabilities, students who are English learners, a big portion of students in California. That kind of assessment is a very different thing, and it actually drives learning. It drives greater effectiveness. There's some evidence of that from several studies. And if you have that kind of thing as the gateway to licensure, first of all, it prepares you then to be ready to become a National Board Certified Teacher because you're doing very similar processes. But it also develops a student learning orientation because you're always thinking about, why did I make these decisions for this planning? Of course, you also give your planning decisions as part of it. And then what did I see about who learned what and what I would do next? And that's the orientation to effectiveness that we want all teachers to have. I don't think you get that by sitting down and taking a multiple choice test. And so I think that that's a move for the profession to begin to make. The thing I showed in New Mexico is really based on that. A lot of states are moving away from a single way to demonstrate basic skills or content knowledge to saying you could do that through coursework that demonstrates that you've got that knowledge where you've succeeded at some level, and then focusing on practice. And I think it's just, important to do that. And it's also possible for states to give incentives for people to participate in things like board certification, which does promote greater effectiveness, both individually or as groups. Some schools are using that with their SIG money from the federal government, which is for school improvement. If you have schools that are identified for improvement, are using some of those resources to help teachers together as a team, engage in those kinds of practices.
And I would just like to add as well, National Board Certification, just increasing the teacher's knowledge of that and what the process is like and how Linda just described it is important because National Board Certification is actually by teachers for teachers. So teachers themselves sit on the board and sit on the standards committees and actually help to develop the process. And so it is by the profession for the profession. And a practical way is just to have some board certified teachers speak at faculty meetings and share their experiences, because I think just understanding how powerful it is to be able to think about your teaching, and especially in cohorts, lots of districts have cohorts that go through together. It's really powerful, and it's an experience that board certified teachers like to speak about. And then, of course, the incentives for me, there was a district incentive that paid part of my national board certification. So there's the incentive of professionalizing and improving my practice, but also the financial incentive as well, and also moving along on the salary scale and schedule was part of the incentives as well.
Thank you.
And we mention it because it has such powerful standards that are much more elaborate and content rich, as well as learner focused, than you typically will otherwise find in evaluation systems.
Dr. Wilson.
Dr. Darlingham, thank you very much and Dr. Hyder for your presentation. I'm struck by this idea of system and the connection that you made to teacher preparation programs, the day-to-day support of principals and building leaders, to teachers in the classroom, which then ultimately we lead to evaluation. It's like the cyclical process, perhaps after teacher preparation, although PD could probably be lumped into that. But I wonder if, and of course we're focused for our purposes right now on teacher evaluation, but it strikes me that you can't necessarily talk about one without talking about the other. And, kind of where do you jump into that cycle so that ultimately we are affecting student achievement, I guess as quickly as we can. We know it's a marathon, not a sprint, but my goodness, it's just, I wonder where you jump in and how we marry all of those other pieces together in a way that is meaningful, purposeful, and ultimately leading to student achievement gains as quickly and effectively as we can.
Yeah. When Connecticut first did its major reforms of teaching back in the 80s, which drove them to #1 status in achievement in the country within a decade, they did principal evaluation and teacher evaluation at the same time. They developed a principal evaluation system, which was heavily dependent on principals' evaluations, principals' abilities to understand teaching. And how to look at it and how to support it and how to enable it. And then they did the teacher evaluation thing at the same time. They put in place a portfolio for beginning teachers, which was part of their way of being assessed, and train people for that. But they thought about all of that together. And I think this might be an opportunity for you to think about those pieces together. The other thing they did was transform the licensure system. They looked at the standards for licensure and the standards for evaluation together. And you have that opportunity too, because Virginia is part of the teacher licensure collaborative that's looking at that question. So you could make some, you can't do everything at once. And I know that's always a challenge, for all of us, because our systems tend to grow up in kind of, there's like a geological dig of policies, that we have to unpack. But I will say, as board chair in California, I've been working on that for the last, I was previously with the Teacher Credentialing Commission, a decade of lining these things up, and it does make a difference. If you figure out where you can start, given what's on your plate right now, but keep that in mind in everything that you're able to work on over the coming years, you will get to a place. We also put in place, by the way, not only the teacher performance assessments for beginning teacher licensure, but administrator performance assessments, which are now in place for administrator licensure, which require principals to learn in their preparation and to demonstrate as they get the license that they can look at teaching, understand it, and evaluate it thoughtfully, and come up with approaches to support teachers in their growth and learning, which then has forced the principal preparation programs to focus on that and other things as part of what they do. That was borrowed from Connecticut and Massachusetts and other states that are kind of moving in those directions. So I am empathetic to the challenge, and just put your bucket down with what's in front of you and keep it in mind as you have the opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Mann.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I want to piggyback on something Mr. Swan asked and just get your perspective on the Praxis performance assessment for teachers, which is intended to be more performance-based. I wondered if you had any perspective on the evolution of that work vis-a-vis what we were speaking about around more performance-based approaches to assessment.
I think it's a reasonable starting place. That the PPAT, as it is fondly known, actually started in California as well. It was ETS did our first version of or actually it might have been NES that did the first version, but it is very similar to the PPAT, where it's a set of tasks that teachers engage in while they're being prepared, and it does focus on the right kinds of things. It's a little less holistic than the performance assessment that I described that we have developed, and we've now got a new iteration in California that goes even further to integrate all the elements of of how you learn to teach. That you have to plan around your students and the content. You have to teach it. You have to look at student learning, and it's tied together. But the PPAT has those pieces in smaller parts, and it's a good start towards a more performance-based system.
Dr. Duran.
Thank you very much for your presentation. What really resonated with me is the constant reminder we need to have that evaluation is really a process and not those single events that are procedural events with tasks. So in your presentation, you correctly noted that here in Virginia, much of our evaluations, if not all, rely heavily on principals and assistant principals to enact that. What are some immediate thoughts that you have for us, whether it's references to other best practices and models out there? How do we shift that culture quickly through what we can do as a state board to help shift again from individual going in, evaluating, and then coming back in the next time and the next time? What are some structural, procedural, immediate things that you could recommend that would benefit us as we try and change that focus and that culture?
If you can think about ways to encourage, and I know there's always financial concerns, and I'm clearly aware that state boards don't control the purse strings. So you'd have to think about how to bring this together. But if there is a way to get to a mentoring system where districts can identify expert teachers in content areas who will participate in the support for beginning teachers, that will take some of the big load off of principals, particularly in schools where you have a churn and you have a lot of beginning teachers coming in, and we know that typically teacher experience and often teacher qualifications differ across communities that different types of students have different levels of money. And so being able to get some focus on getting expert teachers in the schools where they are where the beginning teachers are mostly found, and supporting them and mentoring them will take a lot of load off the principal, who is otherwise expected to, not only evaluate teachers, but be the source of learning for teachers and, help them improve. And it's just too much. If collective bargaining allows, and if your system can accommodate it in the peer assistance and review context, quite often those teachers are enabled to be part of the data system, the evaluation information system for those candidates. And then the other one is when you have teachers who are struggling. It's one thing for principals to, see my practice and give me some feedback if I'm doing reasonably well and I'm setting my goals and I've got a collaborative opportunity to work with other teachers around my goals. It's another thing if I'm really struggling. And again, the principal needs help to help me, and having mentor teachers in place for that is also critically important, who can come in then and be an additional resource. So I'd say that's a really important place to begin. The other thing, of course, is that no principal can know all of the content that you need in a high school. I laughed when I was doing work on teacher evaluation years ago. There was in one session I was doing in New York State, one teacher raised her and she said, I always get good evaluations. She was a French teacher. She said, when the principal comes into the room, I tell the students in French, if you know the answer, raise your right hand. If you don't know the answer, raise your left hand. And all the kids are raising their hands, and I'm asking questions, and everybody I call on knows the answer, and I get a good evaluation. And, it is important. It's very hard to do content-based evaluation every year for every purpose, but it is important to do it sometimes. And those are at those key junctures for tenure and later. And if we make evaluation for tenure supportive and real, and we don't give tenure to teachers who shouldn't get it, but we are supporting them with mentoring, then the rest of the evaluation system becomes easier too, because you are only then dealing with folks who are, competent, and you're helping them improve. And that takes some of the burden off. I like the fact that Virginia only requires a formal evaluation every 3 years once a teacher has become tenured and has met an effectiveness bar, because that means the principal can spend time. It doesn't have everybody in the school to work with, every year, because it's just overwhelming. And then, I didn't get a chance to look at every part of your evaluation handbook. It's very long. It has a lot of pieces. I did look at it, but it did feel like there are a lot of elements of process. And you might think about whether you can prune any of those, whether principals who are good at supporting teacher effectiveness could give advice about ways to make it, as efficient for them as possible.
Thank you. And one follow-up. I really appreciated your reference to the need to have development of cultural knowledge and competence for teachers, and your acknowledgement of the work we've done here on this board, where we approve cultural responsive teaching and equitable practices as part of our evaluation standards. I would just like to hear if you have any other comments of other best practice states, or where you're seeing that movement move forward in a way that's benefiting students. What have you seen in that area?
I think a lot of states are looking at this right now, and some have put in some standards like that, and helping figure out what the professional learning is around that, and what you look at in the evaluation. So when we looked at Mary Edmonds' class in science, I would say that she demonstrated a lot of the elements of culturally responsive practice, because she was attuned to her students, she was affirming to them, she knew them. I don't know what she did before that video to get there, but we have to begin to capture some of that learner pedagogy in the evaluation process to enable people, and then think about what the learning opportunities will be, and give principals and superintendents some help in thinking about how to develop those. Some of it may be explicit professional development, and some of it may be those other two-way pedagogies that a lot of people, struggle with culturally responsive pedagogical language, and they think that it means that you have to learn things about different cultures that sometimes can come out in stereotypic ways. Like, okay, now I got to learn about, this culture or that culture. And then that can lead to thinking that every child who comes from that particular background has a particular set of practices, which they may or may not have. So you want to learn about the community. You want to understand the parents. You want to give people opportunities to be thoughtful about their learners, and to be learner-centered, and to be affirming, and to minimize stereotype threat and the things I talked about, but not to get into a simplistic approach to it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Sultan.
Well, I'll just chime in with the thanks, Dr. Darling-Hammond and Dr. Howler. As always, you all are just hugely helpful and putting us in the big perspective and the systems approach. One piece I have a question on, talking about mentoring. That is something that we have recommended, put in our standards, but don't yet have funded, let's just put it that way, in any significant way. And I guess my question to you is, can one do effective mentoring systems without financial resources? Or in other words, do you have to have either full-time mentors or teachers who are compensated in a significant degree for their mentoring time? Or can effective mentoring systems work without more money, or without significant more money? If that's a fair question.
Well, people do it in a variety of ways. It does take some resources, because you either have to free up the time for the mentors. Like if you're in a middle or a high school, you could free up part of a teacher's time to mentor another teacher. but they do need some time to do that. And some of that time needs to be when the teacher can go into the other teacher's classroom and give them some advice. So some of it can be part-time. Sometimes people also will have a teacher on mentor status for a few years, and they'll serve 10 teachers or 12 teachers, and they're paying for that salary of that mentor teacher. So there's going to be some resources, at least in terms of time and scheduling, that has to happen, at least for the release time. And then, of course, in some systems, mentors are paid more because they are accomplished and using that. It may be actually time on top of the time that they're also spending teaching. So all of those are considerations. The cost and one of the ways that we talk to districts about this is that if you have a teacher leave, and by the way, a teacher who gets good mentoring is twice as likely to stay as a teacher who does not get mentoring. And if you have to replace that teacher, it's going to cost you usually about $20,000 to replace the teacher. And people are desperate right now with teacher shortages being what they are to keep the teachers that they have. So they can think about it as something that if you do it well, it pays for itself because it's, you're not having to spend money you would otherwise spend just to manage the churn that you otherwise get. But it is something that does require some kind of resources, and people have to figure out ways to find those. Now, I'm seeing a lot of people doing this, training up mentors and coaches as part of the ARPA money that they're getting from the federal government, because it is allowed to support staffing stability, and having mentoring and coaching is actually a way to support staffing stability.
Thank you.
Dr. Robertson.
Very quickly, I'll say thank you too. That was a very effective presentation and very helpful. I was struck by slides 28 and 34, particularly 28 being the illustration of how the U.S. Stacks up with the rest of the world, with that sample of countries in terms of time for collaboration. Thank you for sharing that with us. It certainly challenges us. Slide 34, I really appreciated how you reminded us that quality PD is not a one-shot deal, and how sustained work in a collaborative manner is going to be most effective over time. And I really appreciate how you've placed emphasis on the National Board Certified Teachers Program. I don't know the extent to which the entire board has been made familiar with the program. I know that some of us around the table have worked with it closely over the years. It might be worth our time for us all to get somewhat of a primer in the National Board Certified Teachers Program. VCU has been into it for over 2 decades, and I would posit to say that in the Richmond area, perhaps we have the greatest percentage of NBCT teachers on a per capita basis, among the school districts, because of how it's been a point of emphasis. It would be good too for us to learn what the state's history has been with this. Some school systems have over time found that incentivizing teachers to participate in the program is really important in order to generate the enthusiasm, obviously, and also to contribute to this a rising tide lifts all ships notion within school systems. And some school systems then have added to the base salary of teachers a healthy stipend because they made their way through this opportunity successfully. The state, I believe, may have matched that at one point, and then may have pulled back from that in tough times. So it's good to know that the state has recognized that this is a valuable professional development experience. It might be time for us to revisit that from the perspective of the state. Thank you.
Yeah, I've got, I guess, one question.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I just wanted to add one thing, which is that I don't think I mentioned this, but National Board Certified Teachers have been found to be not only more effective teachers, but more effective mentors of beginning teachers. So they can help be an engine in the system
I was going to say it's an easy way to find those folks to be mentors, because if you're board certified, you can start with those, and then of course there's other accomplished teachers, but it's an easy marker to know that they have that knowledge, skills, and positions in the classroom to be able to then have the training to mentoring as well.
If you had to pick one of the states, which one would you model after? Who's doing this best?
Well, different states have different pieces of this, and at moments in time, some states have had like lots of the pieces, and then sometimes the politics change, and the next administration starts to take out some of the pieces that were there too. So I've written about the work that Connecticut did. They had a omnibus bill back in the late 80s, and then throughout the 90s, they put in place just about every element of good practice for that we've been talking about. North Carolina did something very similar, which lived on until the early 2000s, and they still have many of the features there. They have so many of the policies there. Massachusetts has done some good work, and I would say California is becoming a good model because we've been working hard at these different elements.
So if it's,
and there's the other thing that are doing specific things well, so I'm happy to be a resource as you think about where you want to go to help you connect to people in the states that are doing the specific things that you want to work.
I guess, I'm on this board. I think I'm, the businessman, if you will. I don't have the educator background, so you'll forgive this question. If it's so clear that this is right, that is, that this is the right direction, how come more people aren't doing it? In other words, I think, we as a board sort of state our goals as we want to improve student outcomes. And this, by the way, is not a challenge to your work, which, makes clear sense and I believe is right. What I don't understand is, what is it just theoretically right and near impossible to put into practice because of the, I'm serious about this because, we don't pay enough, for example. We can't attract the people you need in order to make the system work the way you want it to work. What are the impediments here to, like I said, I believe everybody, regardless of party, if you ask what the purpose of the school system is, it's to do the best for our kids, right? That's what we're all here for. And if we had a clear right answer, in my world, we talk about this with poverty. If there were a clear right answer to cure poverty, we think it would be done. It's a harder problem than to just say we're going to institute these things. What do we do here to, what are the drags on this that cause it not to be implemented? And, how do we overcome that? My second daughter has a California teaching license. I think she still has it. She taught for a couple of years in the San Diego area in a fairly poor school. And she's got her master's from, University of Southern Cal, and, had decent training, did all the stuff. 2 years in, she said, I'm getting absolutely no support. I'm in a poor jurisdiction. And so even here, you still have the have not problem, right? Where the better or the perceived to be better or, wealthier jurisdictions perhaps put more levels of support around their people, more experienced people gravitate toward it. How do we get this from the theory into the practice so that overall, our goal is to raise every child, not just the mean, right? Not just the upper group, to raise the mean performance levels. How do we get there from here, and what's stopping us?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And you said, how do we get from theory to action? I think part of it is having a theory of action that places teacher competence and principal competence, at the center of the investments and the policies. In business, you said you're a businessman, I think.
Yeah.
Typically, there's a great appreciation for the development of personnel. And most businesses, certainly substantial ones, put a lot of resource into how do we develop, competence. And so that's important in that context. And when Connecticut did its big reforms, they adopted a theory of action that the way we're going to get stronger achievement is by investing in the knowledge and skills of teachers and principals, and we're going to do it in all these ways. And it worked, and it has worked. And same thing happened in North Carolina, where Governor Hunt, had started out to be a teacher. His mother was a teacher. He was committed to it. He said it was hard to become a teacher. He decided to become a lawyer. It was easier that way. But he really had a commitment to that theory of action. Typically in education, though, we have not had that theory of action. We've often thought that teachers were widgets. Hire whoever you can hire off the street, who you babysit the children, for the lowest possible wage. And we haven't thought about the fact that you really need a lot of skill to do the job that we want teachers now to do. So the treating teachers like widgets has meant that we've put a lot more energy into other things, like getting a teacher-proof curriculum or getting a testing system. We spend a lot of money on testing children because that was a theory of action, that if we would test the kids, then that would drive teaching in the right direction. But teachers can't do what they don't know how to do. And so, investing in learning is critical. So it is a theory of action. And then when you adopt that theory of action, it needs to be systemic, as we've been talking about. And I think that that is doable. I've seen some states do it. It's made a big difference. We've seen the achievement gains. I mentioned North Carolina. They were 48th in the nation in mathematics when they started a process of investing in preparation and evaluation and assessment and compensation of teachers, and by tying those all together. You don't want to raise teacher salaries without also raising teacher knowledge and skill. So you have to bring those ideas together if you want to get effectiveness at the other end. And within 10 years, they were way above the national average. It was the first southern state to break the national average. Virginia is sometimes considered a southern state and came a little later than that in math. And so it can be done, but they were dogged about it and they stayed on it. And they believed that that was the important way to do their thing.
So
So,
I appreciate
and
that.
it's a feminized occupation too. Quite often, people in the olden days, there was explicit assumptions that women should earn less than men and da 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 da. And that actually drove the way the teaching profession evolved in the United States.
I mean, we also, I guess, one of the things, I read the chapter in your book, and you mentioned, I think in Finland, one of the things they did was go to 5 years for the prep programs and, change the competitiveness, read the book before on that. So, our trend seems to be going to less time in training teachers, right, to get people out and through. And I'm wondering, I know this is a little bit off topic, your sort of opinion on the trend to say, we need more, therefore we're going to produce them less expensively.
Yeah, I was sad when Virginia gave up the 5-year requirement. Virginia was kind of out front on that because it was really, as you say, it was like what Finland has done, and that moved them from being one of the lower achieving countries to being one of the higher achieving countries because they really did invest in high quality preparation. I think that you can still get a good preparation to teach in a 4-year program and an undergraduate program if it's well designed, and if you get a full year of clinical practice under the wing of an expert teacher in a setting that is designed to be like a teaching hospital, a place where you learn to teach. It's about how do you use the time well. But when people come in without preparation, the evidence is that they leave faster and do less well for children. And that often happens when we have alternative routes that don't require some people to have that training before they get there. I came into teaching that way myself, and I can tell you how challenging and difficult it is, and it certainly contributed to my not staying as long as I would have liked to stay in profession. So, I think, partly if you're going to have less time, you've got to use that time really well and make sure that people get the clinical practice as well as the coursework.
Thank you. Anybody else? I know we've used an hour and a half of your time, and anybody?
This isn't a question for her, but I am curious in the conversation we were having about the board certification matter. Just what do we know about the current supply of board certified teachers in the Commonwealth? I'd be curious. about that, if there's a way to just understand that. If it's not being collected, I'm not calling for a data collection activity, but I just think it would be interesting to sort of understand that in the context of the remarks that have been made on that in particular.
I'm sorry, to follow on, where, in what divisions are they? Do they actually stay in the divisions? For how long do they move around? All of those kinds of things.
Dr. Johnson's waving to suggest she has.
No, I can't see Dr. Johnson behind the screen, so. Yes. Hello.
That falls under the.
Yeah, doctor's
teacher
on
ed
the
and
screen. There's a
licensure.
doctor coming to the podium, so.
That falls under teacher ed and licensure.
I couldn't see.
And
Okay.
so we support VCU, as you mentioned, Dr. Robertson, as well as a grant from the state for those that achieve that recognition. And so we, as well as their national organization, can provide information on the amount, the year, and the demographics of where those teachers are. So just that would be an easy request.
Okay.
Oh, awesome. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you.
And if you're done with us, we will take our fond adieu.
Yes, thank you so much.
Great to spend time with you. Good luck. Call on us anytime.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, we can either go on with this or learn how to do American Ninja Warrior, your choice. Maybe easier. All right. We want to do a quick break before we do the discussion? Or do you want to keep rolling?
Well, we have another presentation.
We do.
yes, So
Yeah,
maybe
let's
we
talk.
debrief a little bit.
Yeah, let's
take a break,
debrief
and
then.
Come back.
That'll work for me. Okay. This is all part of the, what do we do next? What are the board priorities and goals for, 2022? Some of the things that make me happy, of course, is when people tell us we're in the right path. And, some of the things we clearly heard, I think, were teacher mentorship, principal mentorship are critical components to the system, which, after a couple of years of study is where this board ended up and, built into the prescribed standards of quality. Not yet approved by the legislature, but at least prescribed. So I feel like we've been going down a pretty good track. And we don't have to repeat that process there. Question is, though, what are we looking to do in 2022? One of the things we had talked about at length over the last year was the evaluation system. In particular, in those days, it was linking the evaluation system to professional development opportunities. We are aware that the department is going through, the process of revising the evaluation system. I'm not going to ask the new superintendent the details of where you are on that, because it would be too much to expect for, day 3 or whatever this is. But it may be that we let that process play a little longer without the, significant active participation of the board, or it may be the board's desire to, be in that process more significantly. That's sort of part of the discussion for today. And then what other areas of interest are there? And, just cause, throw out as conversation starters. One of the things that is moving through the legislature, and frankly, this board has talked about before, is literacy in the Commonwealth. Again, very much linked to the board's desire to improve the quality of education for all of our children. It may be we want to discuss and look at standards around that. And then, a topic that probably only I have got such a significant interest in, but because I think it's here to stay and it's not clear to me it's being done as well as it could be, should we have standards around virtual education? And I know this is different from the providers, but, we don't really know yet what works in terms of synchronous, asynchronous, how it ought to look, to the extent that we are going to continue to have in the Commonwealth, and, maybe not in the same percentages we saw during, the height of COVID, but there's clearly going to be a decent chunk of it. perhaps we ought to be looking at standards and studying, what does work, what doesn't work. Are the ratios that we have now for teachers to students appropriate in that setting? Should they be different? How much time ought to be synchronous at different grade levels, all those kinds of things. I don't know if the board has any appetite for that, but I throw those things out as a way to at least begin this conversation. And, perhaps we can, talk about things that are on your mind that, we could focus on for 2022. I can't believe I'm saying 2022. Wow, time flies.
So I'll jump in. I just think every time we hear from Dr. Darlingham, and we all come away feeling smarter, and it's just such a treat. I think that we have gotten some things rolling on evaluation system, but I don't think we've done what she said, which was have we don't even have a work plan to do an integrated approach to teacher evaluation, principal evaluation, professional development, licensure, and teacher prep programs. We've got pieces in several of those, but we don't have an integrated approach. And I would love it if when the legislature gives our new superintendent a chance to catch her breath, which may be a couple of months from now, but if in partnership with the department, if we could figure out a work plan for an integrated approach to those 5, all of which are kind of in our control. We don't really need new
No, we don't need a new legislative authority for that.
legislation
That's
or
correct.
financial resources to do what is within our purview on those topics. That we might be, and we've got, we could ask Abtel, for instance, to take leadership on the teacher prep programs and the licensure piece, at least in terms of coming up with recommendations for us. And then we could tackle the evaluation and professional development, teacher and principal evaluation and professional. And so rather than just leaving it to the staff work on evaluation in isolation from all of those, if we could, as a board, help work in concert with the department and the new superintendent and staff, if that's of interest. And as I say, you're right. It's even too it's unfair to ask the superintendent what are her priorities yet. But if that was something we could all work on together, I would see a way for the board to be engaged sooner rather than later on the evaluation. What we've been shown on teacher evaluation involved us later in the process. But I hearing that it needs to be part of a system approach maybe should involve us earlier.
Before Superintendent Balo responds, my largest concern is that in a vacuum, the evaluation doesn't move the needle. And the other components that seem to move the needle, which are things we have asked for and not gotten, like legitimate teacher mentorship programs and principal mentorship programs, right? Real building leadership. We have not seen funded. And I would be delighted for the board to stay involved with the work the department is doing with regard to evaluation. My understanding was a lot of that had been hired out as opposed to being done in-house.
Oh, and so that would be, I would chime in, one of my suggestions is that we think about whether we need to get external support for a more systems approach. Hiring somebody like this level of expertise that we've seen today to help advise us on the systems level, and whether she's available or whether other leaders would be more available or more, but get that level of expertise to come in and help us think systemically.
I'm happy to do this, Ann.
And think about
to
what
get
we
to
can
the
do.
end of the day and just have an evaluation system change would not be a good event in my life. I would
And you
feel like
mentioned the mentorship, but even if we don't get new money for mentorships, we do have these professional development requirements that we have some control over. People are going to classes to accrue credits for professional development to renew their licenses because they have to do it now every 10 years instead of every 5 years. So they're spending or wasting money on existing professional development requirements. we could use those, if we had tackled the professional development, our authority over professional development, connected to licensing and tied that into what we're doing on evaluation. And we do have say over both principal evaluation and teacher evaluation. Those pieces might be things that are within our purview that we could actually move the needle on. And that might be things we could all, work well together on.
Superintendent, do you want to jump in this fray?
I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Just
Sure.
more as a question, and come back and tell us in 2 months
Yeah.
what you think about it.
Yeah, I think that call to action is a really good opportunity for me to learn what's aligned and what isn't aligned. And my hunch is that in 2 months, when we visit, VDOE staff is going to be able to tell you that some of those pieces are already aligned. And maybe it's a way of the board thinking about how do we put a framework around that? How do we package that in a way that that it's delivered to schools as a system, not as pieces of an evaluation or professional development to seek your credentials. And currently nationwide, it feels very disconnected. My hunch is that it is less disconnected, and it will be less disconnected if we can package it in such a way. The other thing that I would just maybe add to the list is and we mentioned it earlier, is really having a heartfelt discussion about national board certification and other opportunities that teachers have to be leaders within their schools, not just becoming administrators or principals, but really having some different opportunities to make the organizational chart in a school, if you will, a little more dynamic, so that there are teacher leaders and there are some opportunities for promotions for teachers themselves. I know that those in relation to everything from a school's climate to retention of teachers, those are all really great ways to engage that, and student achievement. I think that if we identify, this is my hunch, I don't know this for sure, but if we identify clusters or areas across the Commonwealth where there are more nationally certified teachers or teachers that have leadership opportunities, that we'll find that student achievement is also higher in those areas. So I just think it would be really important for this board to continue deliberating on what does a system look like, not just an evaluation system, but an aligned system that really moves a school or a division forward, because these pieces have become part of a system. So I hope that's what you're looking for.
Wilson?
So I concur with Ms. Balo's observation that it is the system. And so thinking about our work plan for 22, Mr. Gecker, President Gecker, for me would not be being tunnel visioned on developing a teacher evaluation, but really broadening that view a little bit. And maybe our work plan around that issue is about developing a framework for the system itself. So maybe that's where our work is for 2022. And I would encourage us, as Dr. Darling-Hammond talked about, I've forgotten what state it was, but developing a theory of action or adopting a theory of action, and that becoming the driving force that we all double down on for whatever series of years it happens to be. And there is a work plan, multi-year, decades. And when she said it's been a decade or 2 decades, I'm like, wow, because that's exactly what it's going to take. But if we focus on that, then we begin, I think, to see more traction built and hopefully results. And we're not, kind of ping-ponging around to what it is we're focused on, but think about it, big picture, and then narrowing in on the steps along the path would be my suggestion. Because I don't think that focusing on teacher eval right now makes sense. In a vacuum, it doesn't make sense to me.
Yes, ma'am.
I would support that. And I also think the point that you make about the resources that it takes to get this right can't be overlooked. I think that is the frustrating, dynamic in systems such as these, that there are enormous expectations placed at the feet of teachers, administrators, and there is insufficient resources to support it. And I feel like if there's going to be a call to action, then it must be across time, across administrations, because when we don't do that, we keep the spin, the drag. President Gecker, you said, what is the drag on the system? The drag on the system, in my mind, a lot of times is situated on people come, people go, priorities shift, priorities change. The reality is having good teachers, well-trained teachers, well-supported teachers before our children matters. And we have got to have the courage to say, we do the thinking about what it takes. If we don't put the money to support it, why are you expecting to see things be different for children? I love the systems thinking. I love the idea that we, have to disabuse ourselves of magic bullets and thinking it's just get this one thing right and it's going to change it. It's not. Learning is dynamic. We saw that in action in the video that was played before it. You go into classrooms, you see that, but yet we can't get out of our way and allow for the kind of support that makes a dynamic learning process work be realized. And so I could support focusing on a system strategy as long as there's a shared understanding that it doesn't get teed up as now go do this and there's no money for it. That is frustrating. That is demoralizing. That makes you say, I need to be someplace else. I don't have the tools I need to succeed here.
Anybody else? Dr. Robertson?
I won't disagree with anything that's been said. I'll just add more to our list. I would hope that we would keep front and center a focus upon what we know about the research and how it speaks to quality early childhood education experiences, and that the board will take an interest and demonstrate that interest publicly and getting reports and updates on how we stand within the Commonwealth. Similarly, I hope that we'll get reports on the leadership pipeline. I really appreciate everything that we're talking about right now in terms of teacher evaluation. Linda Darling-Hammond wanted us to be compelled as well to talk about principal evaluation. I'm not talking about that here. I'm talking about getting quality leaders in the seats. And I hope that we will continue to emphasize the need for having not only a healthy pipeline, but a quality pipeline. I also believe that we need to monitor what's happening across the street in the General Assembly. Obviously, I know we will during the legislative session, but to the extent that we can give greater support of, influence to, or oomph to what is happening with the discussion about school construction. There appears to be a great alignment of the stars right now to position the state in a way that it's a leader in helping fund construction. And I hope that we will follow that and seize the opportunities that may be there for us to give leadership to that agenda. Thank you.
Dr. Durham.
Echo all my colleagues' comments on the evaluation and the system approach, but I want to double down that I believe it's very important that we as a board begin to focus in 2022 on the efforts being made around literacy. It's a critical time and a juncture for us to finally have another systems approach of thinking around what we do in the Commonwealth around evidence-based instruction for literacy. We've not had that as a Commonwealth. We've seen pockets of that occurring. There's some movement. Our superintendent spoke on a bill today that moved out of subcommittee to the full committee. There's a lot of great effort being done, but if we're not connected to that, because it's not just going to be, as Dr. Mann said, a silver bullet to have the legislation passed on one hand. We're going to have to continue to provide support. And it's actually connected in somewhat to the last conversation, right, around what Dr. Darling Hammond said, around having that instruction and that curriculum in place. We've seen failure, I believe, on the Commonwealth's part to really adopt instruction and interventions that are based in evidence. And we've seen a failure in not providing the money and the resources for school divisions to help our students move forward. We've invested a lot of money in other things, quick bullets here and there that have not yielded results. And our teachers are really struggling trying to help support students. So literacy, I believe, needs to be a very important goal of this board that we focus on. There are several bills I'm looking right now online. There's about 3 or 4 bills right now in the General Assembly that are all aligned as a systems approach. And so I really encourage us to keep close to that and to provide the leadership at this level needed jointly with our state superintendent. Her and I were having a side conversation earlier, and it's an area of her background and expertise that she'll bring to our Commonwealth. And I think that together we can really make a difference in Virginia.
Yeah, Ms. Holton.
So just thinking what's within our board authority, as opposed to other players, the English standards of learning, if I'm just checking, are in their 7-year cycle for adoption in 2024. So it may well be that our role, that we can help infuse that process with the,
We have a role there. We'll have a role in
align that
licensure.
with the work going on
We'll have a
literacy.
role in teacher prep programs. I mean, we're delegated teacher prep and licensure.
Under the new.
No, I mean, we're
the-
delegated that authority now.
Yeah,
And
right,
so
right.
we will be involved in that process in
Right.
one way or another.
Right. But as we rewrite the 2024 standard is right around the corner in the way this world works. So we've got history standards up this year, math standards next year, and literacy, English the following year. So,
Although we have much more direct control over this area through licensure and teacher prep.
oh, you
because-
think that may be even more important than the
Well, it may be more
SOL.
direct for us.
Yep.
The locals really have more control over how it gets taught. And, we have, I'm not sure the standards would change dramatically for the method of teaching
Okay.
as much as the licensure requirements and teacher prep programs would have to change in
Okay.
order to accommodate what I understand to be proposed at the legislature.
The other thing, just in venturing into the priorities conversation, not just the reacting to Dr. Darling Hammond, I did want to reiterate what Dr. Robertson pointed out about the early learning. Early childhood is of necessity on our agenda this year because the continuing rollout of the work that
Right.
we've already begun in that area will be I hope, a major focus of our efforts this year, getting that right.
Yeah, I figure that's why we have Dr. Mann.
Absolutely. And Jenna Conway,
Yes, no.
mostly tells us what to do, and we mostly say, yes, ma'am. But that will be, I think, on our workload this year, I hope.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is absolutely nobody wants to tackle virtual, which is okay with me. I will lick my wounds and go home sadly, but I will do it.
Don't want to.
Yeah. Mr. Swan.
Thank you for wanting to attack virtual, but right now there's just a lot of how to do and uncertainty with virtual. And speaking from teaching virtually and hybrid and in person, sometimes the teaching can be ineffective because you can be on a screen and only have 2 children. Because some students have to go with their parents to work or to the daycare. And so that's ineffective in itself. And so I think adding the virtual piece in there will be an even more challenge for teachers.
The concept was, Mr. Swan, to figure out how we can do it well. The board approved the consortium of Southwest divisions to do a virtual academy essentially. And yet we don't have standards of, how that ought to be done. What is effective for those kids? We don't have good measurements there. What's the best way to teach? Should we be in our prep programs teaching teachers a little bit differently if they're going to be teaching virtually? Should there be different certification of some sort? Because it's clearly a different feel, right? Look and feel. I've not taught at the K-12, but I have taught at the university level. I've done it in person and I've done it virtually, and it's a big difference. How do you get people to engage even at the graduate school level? It's different, and so the thought was to begin to look at standards around what makes how are kids going to do better, in the virtual environment. And as I said, this is not to talk about who's the desire to have in-person schooling, but if we approve a virtual academy in Southwest, we know it's here to stay, right? I mean, that's something we did just recently. And so, it bothers me a lot that not that we approved it, but that as we move forward, we have not looked at whether the ratios we require for, students to teachers, is right, wrong, in the range, not in the range. We had a discussion about how much synchronous time versus asynchronous time, whether that's right, wrong, or in the range. It is still, as a percentage of our kids, relatively small, and therefore, it might be, left for another day. But I don't want it to be lost sight of, because I think as we move forward, you will see more and more of it in teaching in modules, and some of it pre-recorded lectures, maybe inverted classroom type stuff. You just don't know. But I do think it's worthy of the board's study. But I do also think that if we're going to undertake the large systems review, that will crowd out our ability to do my relatively small topic that's near and dear to my heart.
I would just say I would be interested more so in just understanding what the state of the art is. I feel like at a minimum, having an appreciation for what research we have on understanding, especially with young children. I mean, this is not an offering that's just being made available, to older students. We're talking about, K forward. And I do think developmentally, what we know about young children and how they best learn at that age and stage of life, it would be interesting to understand what the state of the knowledge is regarding this kind of modality for education, for the benefit of the board being educated, such that what we learn might introduce a need to sort of reevaluate our efforts in determining where this should be on a priority basis. I think that piece for me is like an open question, and I'd love to have a sense of what we know from a research perspective.
UVA has produced some research in this area, and I'm sure
Yeah.
that's accessible to us.
So am I not right that we figured out last year that we were, I think, many years overdue in addressing
Yes,
virtual learning regulatory requirements, and we issued a NORA on it.
we did.
So we have, at least in theory, started the process of having staff begin to gather information. I mean, in other words, we're 10 years overdue, and we did something to at least begin the process moving last year. So won't that come back to us in some degree? How assertively we push for it versus wait for it to come back to us in the normal course. But doing nothing is not likely to happen.
Okay, I got that message loud and clear.
Mr.
Yes,
President.
yes.
Thank you. Great conversation, and really nothing to add or counter, except that there is a sense of urgency, not through authority or a pandemic or anything else, but out of necessity for some, an option for others. Virtual education it is not accessible and high quality all the time. And that should be our goal. It should be, a viable option for any student who, either out of need or choice, wants to take part in virtual education. And, the best way maybe over the next year to think about that. And I'm not advocating because I don't even know enough
Mhm.
about the workings of this board and do we have too many priorities or not enough to do so. But it sounds like UVA has some statistics and some data on this. Again, my hunch is based on the great work that I've seen in the VDOE so far. There is some data within VDOE regarding virtual education, and maybe at some point just to have a conversation about the data, make it very transparent, bring it into the open air so that we know what we're dealing with. I think at this point we're having a great conversation about virtual education, but none of us really is able to articulate, and this is what's happening across the Commonwealth.
Mhm.
And so hopefully, if this does find its way onto a priority list, it's at least to acknowledge the sense of urgency around making sure that access to virtual education is always a quality experience.
Okay. So what I hear us doing as a board is we will undertake sort of the systems review approach, teacher evaluation, et cetera, but with the goal of not doing teacher evaluation in a vacuum and basically telling people, we're now going to evaluate you, but we've done nothing else for you, right? I will say some of the pushback I've heard from teachers I deal with has been, you want to evaluate us, but you're really not giving us the tools at the local level we need in order to make this meaningful. The PD is not high enough quality. You're doing something again to us. And as you know, when we started this process, the goal was to do something for, not to, because to me, it's in conjunction with the other things the board, put in the prescribed standards of quality. Dr. Wilson and, Superintendent Balo and I will get together and try to map out, with the department, a plan for how we approach the systems, look at evaluation and other things brought up by Dr. Darling Hammond. We will also coordinate on the literacy piece, which is, I think, as Dr. Duran said, it's needed, it's going to happen, and it is right in the heart of this board's work, right? It's exactly what we want to be doing. And then, if there's a free spare moments that Ms. Balo doesn't mind spending, I'll talk to her about virtual alone. And that's how we can move in. We'll make it all transparent at some day. Does that work? Yeah. Maybe not.
Well,
Ms.
I
Huffman?
think that's great, but I also recognizing that we've got a brand new partner who just walked in the door with Ms. Balo, that we should invite her input so that we can help align our priorities with her priorities to the maximum extent possible, and that would be an occasion, a more productive conversation in March. So I'm agreeing with your list, but suggesting that we also revisit this conversation again in March to the extent it would be helpful to have her. The department's priorities don't have to be the same as our priorities, but there may well be things where it helps to have them aligned and overlap.
It has been our philosophy that the more we align with the governor's priorities, the more we will get done. So that, that's been through the years. And so we will certainly attempt to coordinate on that.
It's a generous assumption to think I will have priorities by March.
Touche.
I'm getting so much older, though. We got to do it soon. Okay. Does that cover that topic well enough? All right. Thank you all. We're going to take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at, just before 3:15, and we'll finish up. Second session. Mr. Bowling, welcome. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you as well. President Gecker, Dr. Wilson, Superintendent Balo, thank you so much for having me today to bring you an update on the high-quality instructional materials, a process, identification process that we are shifting from at the Department of Ed. Before I do start that, I'd like to, first of all, thank Dr. Amy Griffin, former superintendent of Cumberland County Public Schools, that has been a consultant all along the way, doing Yeoman's portion of the work, and like to thank her for that. I'd also like to thank the members of the board that were able to join us just recently for public hearings on the data science standards of learning. So thank you all very much for being there as well. With that, so for many years, the the Board of Education has had the authority to approve textbooks. It is in the Virginia Constitution. It is also in the Code of Virginia, as well in the Standards of Accreditation. And it defines, and I'm going to move through, I have a number of slides, but I'll be moving through them somewhat quickly. If you would like, me to dig in on something, please let me know. And so basically the process has existed for many years, and it was a print-based process that was focused on the approval of textbooks. Now, textbooks, as in the Code of Virginia, is defined as, it means print or electronic media for student use that serve as the primary curriculum basis for a grade level subject or course. And as you all know, there's been a lot of technological changes throughout the years. And so the focus on actual textbooks and physical textbooks has really shifted to electronically based instructional materials, some that are provided through companies like that, and some that are made locally, by either teachers and shared locally, but also by organizations and others. We will be focusing in on this, shifting the process from textbook approval to identification of high quality instructional materials to be used by school divisions, selected by school divisions, and then utilized by teachers for students. Just as a little bit of background, just to make sure everybody's aware, we do develop standards of learning and curriculum frameworks, and those drive what is taught in classrooms in Virginia. Then school divisions develop their local curriculum that is based upon our curriculum framework and standards. And following the approval of standards, typically the year after, Virginia does do a textbook adoption process in that area. So for instance, Ms. Holton, you were talking about English standards being revised in 2024 and starting the process then. They would be approved likely in 2026. I'm sorry, 2025. Sorry, actually they would begin the process in 23 and then approved in 24. And then the year following approval is when we had done the textbook approval process. Then the local school divisions have had the ability to either select from the approved textbooks that were provided by the Department of Education and through the Board of Education's approval process, or they could run a similar process locally to approve textbooks. So having said all that and giving you that background, we'll jump in and talk a little bit more of why the shift. And I alluded to it earlier, is that there's been this shift of teachers moving to more away from print resources to more online resources. I'll be talking in a minute about surveys that we did with teachers to get some information about that, about what they were looking for and what they found to be important. But at the same time, we also found that school divisions were shifting their textbook allocations and moving it towards electronic media. And so we thought that the last time that this process was updated was in 2011, and much has happened in the world since then. And that was actually, that revision process was spurred by an issue with one publisher, for those of you that were around at that time. And there was a problem with a publisher, and so we revisited the process at that time and updated it. And I think it's now time that we move to the next level in Virginia and start identification of high quality instructional materials from which school divisions can select. So we started with finding out what other states were doing. And some of the states that we visited and spoke with and their Department of Education staff was in Maryland and Massachusetts, Nebraska, Louisiana, and others. And we talked to them about their process. They had an approval process for high quality instructional materials versus a textbook approval process. We talked to them about their identification process and their review process, and then any other services or supports that they provided to school divisions in the implementation of those materials. In addition, we also communicated with Ed Reports, because Ed Reports is a national leader in reviewing materials, although they do only review materials in mathematics and language arts at this time. And because we even talked about the possible, we looked at all possible ways. Could we even use their vetting process to pre-vet materials? And so we considered lots of different options. But we wanted to be able to approve materials in more than just language arts and mathematics. And so we wanted to have a consistent process for that. So in October of 2020, we brought to you a written report about the move to high quality instructional materials and established somewhat of a timeline to get started. And from that time, from October, this is where we started. So in December, we started surveying teachers and we received over 870 responses, I believe. That gathered information about materials that they're currently using, what they thought would be important to include in the review criteria and rubric. And also, we had stakeholder meetings during April, May, and September, as well as content work groups with internal staff. We had meetings with publishers as well to talk to them about the process on their side and what is difficult for them or what could be improved on our side, as well as just looking at the practices that we currently have in place. So here's a list of some of the stakeholders that we included, and that was teachers, a great deal of teachers, curriculum leaders and principals groups, as well as directors of special education, CTE. We had our Office of Equity involved as well as superintendents from different regions. And we had Mr. Swan join us on that stakeholder group, as well as VASCD, VASCL, and also the Commonwealth Learning Partnership. So we had a great deal of stakeholder meetings, and at those meetings, we focused in on a couple of things. First of all, what are the criteria to identify what makes a high quality instructional material a high quality instructional material? So the criteria. And then once we had the criteria identified, we then moved to, well, what are then the indicators that should be identified to that leads to the criteria being evaluated. And so we were able to nail down those through these summer work groups. Through those stakeholder meetings. And then we led into taking those to our content area specialists and developing their own rubrics, for instance, in mathematics or in English language arts, et cetera, that align to the overall rubric. Because we know that when you're evaluating materials, you don't look at materials from different content areas in exactly the same way. There are nuances and differences. And so we did allow them to use a framework, but also to allow some difference between the two. And then we had a publishers meeting, and you can see some of the representatives that were included, which was, I don't need to read them to you. But we just got a lot of their feedback, and they were really excited, first of all, that we asked them. And then they provided a lot of good feedback about the medium and for instance, how things are submitted and how communication flows between the department and between the publishers on feedback on what met criteria and what did not meet criteria in that feedback process. And one of the things that they said resoundingly is, it's a 100% paper process, and we would like for it to be electronic. And we absolutely understand that, and it's time to modernize our process now. And so we do have plans to do so as well. So the framework itself, the criteria fell into four areas. First were alignment to the standards of learning, which has always been a criteria. Then alignment to the profile of a Virginia graduate, the 5 C's. And so we felt, all of the stakeholder groups felt very secure on those, that those were 2 that absolutely needed to be there, as well as the third and fourth that talk about instructional design and then the student experience. And so we'll dive in. So those are the 4 criteria. And now we're going to dive into the indicators for each one of those. So we do have a format. It looks like this. And it basically provides the criteria, the indicators, the rating, and then comments from the reviewers, and as well as the rating system being a 1 through 3, either does not meet, partially meets, or meets expectations. And we'll talk about what might be considered by the board for approval here in just a minute, in terms of how many 2s or 3s or things of that nature. So diving into the performance criteria with the indicators, the first one is pretty simple. It's the publishers would then submit an alignment that they feel is right, and then we have our reviewers check that alignment and verify it. And then for the profile of a graduate, it would be those supports, evidence of support of development of critical thinking, creative thinking, communication, collaboration, and citizenship, as well as what are the experiences that we're providing to make sure that we are preparing them for life and careers. In the instructional design area, you can see the list is a little bit more extensive. It dives on in, and it talks about the logical progressions of content, the explanations of subject matter and clarity, representing diverse experiences and perspectives of students, evidence-based teaching and learning practices, connections within and between disciplines, and authentic applications. And then supports for teachers in terms of differentiation of instruction and planning and instructional delivery. I'll dive just a bit deeper into a mathematics version. This is an example of how our specialist in our coordinator in mathematics took the first indicator about the logical progressions and then provided some additional level of review. And those types of the blue lettering would be used in order to help train their reviewers, to make sure that they're being consistent in their reviews and that they're looking at the same components for each material reviewed. Then the next criteria area would be in the student experience. And so the indicators in that area are supporting accessibility for students, supporting student agency, supporting information processing, as well as student engagement through relevant learning experiences. So on the next few slides, we have, so what we've done so far is develop a criteria. Then we move to the actual process itself. And we have a document that you can read now. The current process is linked here. And this chart compares the current process to the proposed changes that we're making to the document. And it's we're anticipating to bring a draft to you in March, but wanted to give you kind of heads up and some background in it before we got to the March meeting. So the current process just looked at alignment to the standards and instructional design. And now we're adding those other areas, the profile of a graduate, as well as the student experience. And we're expanding out on the instructional design to include things like evidence-based practices, that it's built upon evidence-based practices. In the past, or in the current process, it's the rating scale is adequate, limited, or no evidence. And we're just changing that a bit. We are going to propose that no material is identified as high quality instructional material that does not receive a meets expectations in all areas. The current process does require a hard copy submission of everything, including the assurances from the providers, as well as information about the authors. And we will be making that a digital or web-based program for not only for the publishers, but also for the reviewers and the reviewing process. I will tell you that one of my first personal experiences on serving on a Department of Education committee was many, many years ago, probably too many to count, but I served on a textbook review committee, and I was living in a very small house in the city of Richmond, and I got a shipment in of books that took up an entire room in my 1,200 square foot house that my wife at the time was very unhappy with that stack, and she said, well, let's get reviewing, let's get them out of here, you know. And so now instead of having this physical textbooks being shipped to every single household of every single reviewer and to the Department of Education, everything will be made electronically available to the reviewers, to administrators, to parents, to the whole community, and the entire review process will be electronic. And so that includes the final process, where we publicly display materials. We used to have sites throughout Virginia in libraries where we would lay all the materials out, and people would come and view them and provide comment. And that will all be a digital process now. So we're really excited about the upgrade in a DOE process here. Next thing talking about is the review committee selection. So the current process is nominations, and also the selection to make sure that we have representation from across the state and large, and so regional, geographic, regional, and also size of school divisions to make sure that we have great representation of our reviewers. We're not proposing any change to that part. And then the process itself, it will stay the same, except for the fact that we'll have a new criteria, new rubric, and then we will have an electronically based process. The publisher certifications and assurances are really an essential part of the textbook approval process. As such, for instance, if something were to get approved and it's noted that there is a problem with it that none of the reviewers catch, the certifications and assurances say that they will fix the error within a given number of days. And so that's an example. And so we have a number of those in there, and we ask them to assure us that the people that were writing the textbooks were qualified, as well as providing evidence of their evidence-based design. And again, we will keep that part of the certifications and assurances the same. We're proposing that, but it will be in a digital process. Again, the publisher submissions will be digital. Much of these will stay the same, but we're also going to allow them to provide a 5-minute video that kind of orients the reviewers in how to, like, the layout of their materials and how it's all how all the pieces meet. So the teacher's edition, student's edition, and then maybe ancillary materials that are being reviewed externally. The review cycle, we would imagine that it would stay the same, and then school divisions could use our framework and identified materials as high quality instructional materials for their local selection process. Again, the public examination would be a digital process as well. So this just brings us back to the performance criteria. And so I would like to encourage you all to think about a few things. And number one is, do you feel that the criteria includes the things that you want and that you feel are important in identifying high quality instructional materials, as well as reflecting on this. Once we've identified high quality instructional materials and we have this framework, that can be used for a number of things. For instance, we have our Go Open Virginia, which is an open repository of educational resources. Now, some materials can be submitted by the Department of Education in that. Some can be submitted by teachers. Some are if Mr. Swan were to submit something, I could take it and upgrade it for my needs and then republish it. But it would be nice to have something, you have a criteria in place that we could put a stamp of approval that says that it's an approved Virginia high quality instructional material that meets the standards of learning and it meets some of these other criteria. And that, so we could take a version of it for materials that are non-primary instructional materials, like not whole textbook series. What we're talking about is just individual pieces. It might be a museum that wants to submit some materials to help teachers teach a topic. Well, then we could review it under the framework or a version of the framework that is catered to that particular product, and then identify it as a high quality instructional material. Once again, to take the time out to reduce the amount of time teachers need to make sure that the standards are aligned, to speed up the process for them. Because what we found in the teacher survey is they spend extraordinary amounts of time searching and Googling and just trying to find the right lesson for their kids. And it would really help the process if there was some sort of identification of a high quality instructional material at the front that they could say, oh, at least I know that the standards are aligned and it does meet the profile of a graduate and some of these instructional design pieces. And then finally, I wanted to bring to your all's attention one question, and I'm going to skip here over to this screen. Is that I think one discussion that you all may want to have as a board, or just think about prior to the March meeting, is what would be the role of high quality instructional materials when it comes to divisions that require additional support through memorandums of understanding? And would they need to select from our list because we have approved them as a board, or is it something that you want to consider just keeping the process the same? So I do think that that's something that should be at least discussed at some point, and I would recommend it. Now going back to our final slides, next steps here, we will be seeking input from the parents and community, as well as in March, bringing it back to the Board of Education for first review. In June, we're seeing final review. And then the following spring and summer, we'll build out our digital platform and then start implementing once we have the history and social science standards approved by the board, then we can move to the textbook review or the high quality instructional materials review process for history would be the first one out of the gate. So having said all of that, I'm happy to answer questions, and I may have to call on Dr. Griffin to help me with some of the pieces, but would happy to entertain anything you have.
Dr. Wilson, then Mr. Swan.
Mr. Bowling, thank you very much. One observation and a comment. I think I heard you say that at the public examination point of public examination, that the materials would remain in a digital format exclusively.
That is the case, as proposed.
As proposed. So one observation would be in communities where access to broadband high speed is a challenge, do we inadvertently create a situation where people can't access, who may be interested, but won't be able to access the material? So that's an observation that I think we should probably think about.
Absolutely.
And then the second is your question to us about divisions that may be under a memorandum of understanding. My comment would be, to what extent do we feel the need to remove that level of choice for divisions? So the process suggests that each of the 4 criteria are going to be met. That's
yes.
It is certainly work for a division to go through. Well, no. I'm not certain. I'm not certain that I would feel the need to confine a division that happens to be under an MOU to have to choose from materials that the state has already identified if there is a good case to be made for why something else may be most useful in the context of their community. That's just my observation.
I think that those are both wonderful points, and that's one of the reasons why I brought it to the board to just.
I'm just one member.
No, but to have a discussion about it. But because you're right. I mean, multiple perspectives. In terms of your first comment, I do see taking the existing sites and turning them into some electronic viewing sites. So the libraries that already have internet access for families, where they can still come there, view the materials, just not in person, and we would work with them. Those sites are identified across Virginia.
Thank you.
Mr. Swan, and then Dr. Robertson.
Thank you so much for the presentation. So you have stated that basically anyone can submit a high quality, a certain resource to be approved?
I believe the definition of it would be materials that are serving as the basis for a curriculum for a grade level or subject area.
Okay.
So for this process, it would not be something from a museum. That would typically come from some of the major publishers.
Okay. Yes, sir. So how long would that approval process take place before it is actually something that can be rolled out?
We would anticipate that it would take between 9 and 12 months to complete the entire review process.
Okay. So follow-up question as well. When these materials are available, will it be on the VDOE page for teachers to use, as well as can it be, if that is the case, can it be a simple process? Just speaking from experience, going on the VDOE page, it is sometimes a hassle trying to find resources. And so I'm just asking, yeah.
Right. So the actual selection of instructional materials does happen at the local level. And they are procured at the local level. In the past, through this process, what we've asked companies to do is identify the lowest I'm gonna mess these words up. It's the highest amount that should be expected to be paid on a contract. And Leslie might be kind of scouring there when I said that, but I believe that it's a negotiated price at the state level. So that is done at the state level. So I'm sorry, at the local level, the selection is. So therefore, then it's made available to those teachers locally, not for the entire state. We would publish a list of approved instructional materials.
Dr. Robertson.
Thank you, Michael. Great presentation. I think we all know that in recent months, there's been certainly heightened sensitivity to the role that parents play in the selection of materials or the influence of curriculum. And I know that we all want to demonstrate that parent involvement is indeed welcomed and incorporated and influences the direction that we take on so many levels of our programming, from the state to the local levels. I'm pleased to see that February, this next month, just to be highlighted, we are going to be seeking input from parents and the community on this particular process. And I recognize that this process deals primarily with what we would call the selection of textbooks or the basic materials as you described them. Is there along the way still some emphasis placed on the parents' role in the selection of materials locally? Does the state stipulate what parents' participation should be as part of the selection process once we push the options to the localities for their own decision making? Do we say anything about what role parents should have?
I don't believe in the current process that is required of school divisions. However, having done textbook approval processes in multiple school divisions in Virginia myself and led those, we always had a process that involved parents and along the way and input, as well as the viewing the ability to review materials.
That's been my experience
Mhm.
too. It seems to me, in order to make sure that we are open and transparent as much as we can with this particular process, we would want to say something like that,
Absolutely.
that the state recommends that parents participate in these processes if we're not going to require it even.
I think that's a great idea. Thank you.
Dr. Duran?
Just some clarification on the review committee. You said that those are nominations of individuals that serve that are geographically, I think you said, represented across all small, large school divisions. What kind of training or rubrics or guiding language is provided to them for the rating of 3-1 that you described? Because there is some subjectivity that can be concerning in a couple of these. One that I want to raise is on the instructional design. It says represents diverse experiences and perspectives with respect to student cultures and backgrounds. And I've seen time and time again, many review committees not being themselves culturally diverse and having background of diversity amongst the members outside of, yes, I've always seen large school division, small division, northern, southern, central. We've always had a great job done at that. But I haven't seen the same job always done in terms of who is selected to look at this question of whether or not the material actually provides some perspective from populations of students who actually no one on the committee is even representing. So that's concerning to me on one hand, but if there's some training or language that helps us get to another place as we're entering history, there's so many of our instructional materials that we see, and at the local level, that's why we do our own process sometimes, and we find materials that are more representative. And so that's just little concern that I have.
I think it's a great point, and as soon as you brought it up, it reminded me that I missed a very major bullet on this slide in front of you here, is that if you'll see here that we developed not just the framework tools, but then also descriptions of each one of these areas. And so it does outline and provide deeper detail about what we mean by each one of these of the actual areas and the criteria and the indicators. And so then the actual training is done through the content coordinator here at the Department of Education that assembles the team, provides expectations, walks through those descriptions document. And I apologize for not including that on here.
Oh, that's very helpful. But I also, just as one board member, would hope and encourage as we go through that nomination process that we're very mindful of the instructional design question and how we are looking at ensuring that the right voices are either at the table or that the voices at the table are concerned about all student populations, because there's a lot of high quality instructional materials that do not represent our students, and they don't see themselves in some of the literature they read, some of the history. It's missing for them.
Right.
And so then we as school divisions often have to supplement that with other things. And in my mind, if we're having to supplement something, then it's not high quality because it's missing that key part. And it's one of our areas here of our performance criteria. So since it is one, we need to make sure that that follows through to the actual approval process.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And that does, when I was talking about when we're selecting members of the content or the review committees, we don't just look at regional and representation. We also do look at race, ethnicity. We look at gender as well in the composition of the committee to make sure that there's representation.
Thank you.
Dr. Mann? I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Thank you so much. I had just a couple of questions. I was curious about the publishers and just to what extent, because this is not textbook proper, but I know these are like going to be considered in that realm as part of the approval process. Did you find that because we were shifting to high quality instructional materials that it introduced more opportunity for publishers who are perhaps not in the textbook business to be have an opportunity to make resources available through this channel?
We thought it would open up the doors for anyone that has digital content
Mhm.
that was made available. And then when it came down to the local level, if they were looking for a physical textbook, that would be a part of their selection process. But it does make it a little bit more accessible for more publishers to submit their materials for consideration as the primary, as I said, as the basis for the primary curriculum for a grade level or subject area.
Okay. And then with just two more questions,
Mhm.
because I guess as I picture digital content, I tend to see it visually, and this may not in fact reflect what you all are seeing, but I'm curious. more isolated content as opposed to, and I'm looking at the criteria that all of these materials would be judged against, and it's a lot for, and I'm wondering how, are you seeing resources that are a bit more comprehensive in their coverage of some of the content, or is it more isolated concepts within a content area? I'm just really curious about how resources in this space are being evolved to support learning.
I think that the evolution, began obviously with physical textbooks, right? And then there was the teacher resource bank, the box that came beside it, and then maybe some leveled readers and different ancillary materials that are available. Then, as things started shifting, there were electronic versions of student textbooks. That was the next evolutionary piece, and they had the textbooks in the classrooms, which were typically stacked along the wall, and then they gave students a code to log in and review, or to be able to read and use materials. At the same time, I think that there was a shift away from using a textbook to drive instruction and really focusing in on what was essential to the understanding and concept building and the skills and processes that were necessary. And so then I think you started to see a shift of saying, well, we have those materials available, and we stopped buying them physically, but we do have them electronically. And so I feel like there has been this evolution towards just purely electronic resources. In terms of evaluation, those resources would be looked at holistically and not page by page, or because it's hard to, for instance, when we're in the area of the criteria area of meeting the profile of a graduate, not every lesson will necessarily meet every piece of the profile of a Virginia graduate. And so we have to look at holistically about the experiences overall that are provided in the material. Do they align with the profile of a Virginia graduate, for instance?
Okay, and my last question is just on, maybe you can unpack a little bit the definition of how evidence-based is evaluated in the context of the rating, because that is a part of the instructional design. And I'm just curious what kind of guidance is given as people are sort of sizing that up.
Right. So we had a lot of discussions about what evidence-based meant. And so what we decided upon is that we would ask the company to provide evidence of what research in evidence-based practices, instructional practices, were used in the development and were the underpinnings of the material. And that is included in our description, right? We'll have a section on that for publishers. And so we will be bringing this to you, for full review, and we can certainly change that definition or descriptions as necessary if you all see fit.
Superintendent?
Thank you, Mr. President. And I think maybe this is more of a discussion question than a question that you might be able to answer today. But as this is all brand new. I've not worked in a state where the State Board of Education or anyone at the state level was prescribing textbooks or approving textbooks. So that said, I know it happens across the nation, but I can't help but kind of wonder about the purpose for this. And as I before my professional life was turned upside down, that means over Christmas vacation, I was reading an article, I think it was in Education Week, and there was 66% of teachers, teachers use their own either created, purchased, or searched for curriculum 66% of the time. So as we're talking about these other material that the board also has authority over with any school board may use textbooks not approved by the board, provided the local board selects such books in accordance with regulations promulgated by the state board. So that said, if we have 66% of the curricular content in classrooms, and I realize that that's not the Commonwealth, that's across the nation. It was a very large teacher-reported survey. But if that's the case, then going back to that purpose, what is our mechanism as a board to ensure that we are continuing to be aligned to the Virginia standards of learning, the profile of a graduate, instructional design, and student experience? Because my hunch is that not every 23-year-old or even seasoned teacher who's spending 7 hours a week searching for lesson plans or purchasing lesson plans is going through the exercise of making sure it's aligned, making sure that the instructional design is appropriate and that the student experience is appropriate. And that really drives to Dr. Duran's point about sort of just the appropriateness of state selected textbooks or curriculum, and textbooks I'm using loosely, I realize that.
Mhm.
And so I guess just for discussion purposes, it appears to me that at the community level or even at the school level, some of those decisions are best made if we empower school districts to implement this framework, this design for assessing the rigor of high quality instructional materials. So I lay that out there maybe
Mhm.
more as a discussion, kind of maybe the new kid on the block, the new perspective, and just really thinking about the why of all of this and making sure that if we're going to be talking to stakeholders, if we're going through these exercises of approving textbooks and putting ourselves as a board and as a Department of Education out there as sort of approving or giving a stamp of approval, that ought to be a process that applies to 100% of the curriculum, not 44% of the curriculum.
Right.
And then one more point, if I could, Mr. President, is just around transparency. And I love that is one opportunity that we have as a Commonwealth to be very transparent. Here are the approved textbooks. But again, thinking about what does that look like at the community level? Is it required at the community level to also post curricular materials like we do at the state level?
Mhm.
So again, a discussion level or a discussion question, just thinking about the why.
And a couple points to add in, and I think you've made some really wonderful points. Materials. You're right. Many teachers do develop their own materials, absolutely, and they usually base it off of something that they have or have borrowed from a friend or seen in a textbook. What we're hoping to do, and Virginia has identified or approved textbooks for a number of years, and so I think what the identification of high quality instructional materials kind of allows a teacher to say, wow, this is something that's pre-vetted. This is something I can just go ahead and use, and it's been provided to me. It also, the process also helps small school divisions that have a very small capacity when it comes to reviewing and approving materials. They really do value the approval of the department to help them in their process and speed up their process locally and potentially save them time and money. So there are a number of things like that, but yeah, absolutely. I want to take us back to the Constitution and to the Code of Virginia, that the board has the authority. It doesn't say that they shall. And so that's certainly something that the board may choose to not exercise. But that is, I just wanted to point that out. So it's not a requirement of the board.
We'll say a couple of years ago, I don't know if you recall, Mr. Bowling, we talked about not doing it because it is not mandatory. And, the comments that came back were that the smaller jurisdictions didn't have the same resources that the larger jurisdictions had. And we were really acting as a larger resource for the, less well-heeled divisions in the Commonwealth.
Mm-hmm.
And so we continued down this path. At the same time, I thought that we had a discussion that we would actually like to move away from sort of textbooks, or the schools were moving away, and as just suggested, a lot of material is teacher generated as opposed to textbook generated. And I thought we were working toward a system of open educational resources that would provide for the materials needed for the locals to have curricula that were aligned with the standards, et cetera. And I know this doesn't quite hit that topic, but it sort of does, right? I mean, the idea that we ought to be taking a lot of time, to do the textbook approval when it's now a fairly small portion of what happens in the school day to day may not be a great use of the resources as much as providing, again, the open educational resource data bank that we had talked about, years ago, that James had talked about, quite a lot. I guess we will, as a board, as long as the smaller jurisdictions need it, continue to approve textbooks, right? I mean, that's part of the historic role. I think that's what we're going to do, and the process is great. We don't approve the other materials. I will tell you, in a non-scientific sampling of those jurisdictions we have under a memorandum of understanding, in those places where, test scores are not as good as others, the first thing we look for is alignment of the material to the standards, and that alignment often is not there. We would do the Commonwealth a service if we would in fact be more diligent about ensuring, and I know we have the constitutional issue of the locals control the locals, but being able to force an alignment of the curriculum or of the material to the standards would be a very big thing for us long term. And I know in places like Arlington, you're not going to have this problem, right? You guys are aligned, but it surprises me when I go to those meetings, with some of the MOU jurisdictions, and you look at what they're using to teach X, Y, or Z, and it's just not a Virginia, it's not aligned to our standards, and therefore you can't expect those kids to test well on the Virginia tests. Ms. Holton.
From my understanding, am I right too that one of the reasons the many local divisions appreciate us going through this process is if they are spending large sums of money on textbooks, and when they are spending large sums of money, they are required to go through public procurement processes, which are cumbersome. However, they don't have to go through those processes if we have, so to speak. So when we approve textbooks, they are then exempt from the same procurement processes. If they buy outside of our list, then they've got to go through the procurement hoops.
That is,
which it costs
In a
time and
sense,
money.
we act as a service to the smaller jurisdictions
Absolutely.
who really can't do it on their own.
Absolutely.
It's not that we are mandating what's being used. It's we're providing this list of vetted.
And Mr. President, your point about open educational resources is, that now we're talking about getting people good quality stuff for free.
Yeah.
And that's certainly an ultimate goal.
It is.
And
Very
we have a
much so.
tremendous amount of materials in our open resources right now, and it's growing as I speak. And I think it would just, sometimes it's nice when you go into an open resource database to know who developed the material and what their qualifications were and whether or not they were biased in there, because that's the whole purpose of open educational resources, right? Is to allow people to blossom and do what they need for their kids. And so I personally believe that having a stamp that kind of says, hey, this has been vetted, I think might be a benefit to many teachers out there.
But also, one more question. Am I right that regardless of what teachers are in fact using, most school divisions are in fact still purchasing textbooks, whether they're purchasing them in the hardback version or the electronic version, they are still spending a lot of money on these resources?
Yes, ma'am. And part of that is connected to teacher shortages and number of provisional teachers, and making sure that they have resources in place that those teachers can fall back on if they're not 100% confident in the content or the pedagogy associated with that content. Sometimes having something that has been vetted is nice to fall back upon.
Yes, ma'am.
And did I understand that you see this framework potentially as helping offer a lens even on the open source resources that live on the current website, that this can become a framework that helps people sort of look at those resources and make some judgments about them. I understand you're not proposing to have those things vetted, perhaps in the same way that you're suggesting this process would work to approve high-quality instructional materials, but it becomes a framework that could be useful.
100%. We envision this as the framework from which criteria can be made to judge different types of instructional materials. Like I said, an example of a teacher-created material all the way to a museum-created material, or by a small company or group. So we're excited about the possibilities of how this could bleed into things like, for instance, the identification of a high-quality micro-credential in the future. And so if we know that these components are important for content and pedagogy, then maybe that could also bleed into a criteria for micro-credentials, professional development, and some other areas.
But for everything besides textbooks, the department could do that without the board.
Certainly.
And we have no authority, frankly, for anything besides textbooks.
Certainly. And so, we will certainly do what the board wishes, and the superintendent. And so I have provided the information. I hope that it's helpful to you, and I'd be happy to take any other questions.
That's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay. No concluding remarks other than we are adjourned until tomorrow morning at 9.
Thank you.
Thank you.